IB Nation, welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Wednesday. That means it is time for the Notre Dame Midweek Rundown. And we're going to talk about a couple topics today, but there's going to be one topic that's going to dominate today. And it's a topic that's just been on my mind really all summer. And as sort of some negativity started to creep up more and more and more, and the void of not a lot of news for the first time this offseason, which I actually kind of was appreciated because of how crazy this offseason has been. It just some people started to kind of creep in, and it's kind of interesting looking at how some people view this team. And I don't know if it's just that the people that aren't high on this team are the loudest and most vocal and most constant in their comments, or if there is some genuine negativity about this team, where the program is headed. I mean, heck, the show hadn't even started yet, and I banned somebody from the chat. I mean, it's getting pretty wild. But I'm going to tell you all right now, I am excited about this football team. And it's not in the same sort of excitement you get every preseason, right? Like, I'm always excited to watch this Notre Dame team. And you always have this like, well, if this, and this can go right, this team could be pretty good. And it's like this long list of what ifs, right? And I was talking with a good friend of mine who I've known for a long time, known him years. He's a guy that tends to be a pretty pessimistic dude, and he's even fired up about this team. So perhaps it's just the pessimists are the most vocal. But I felt that it was a good time now that football camp is a week away, and we start fall football camp. I'm so fired up, and we'll be there. Whole practice, we're going to be there. I'm excited about it. But I look at this team, and there's a lot for me to be excited about. And there's no better time than a week before camp to go over the 10 reasons why I'm excited about this team. Also going to dive into a little bit I'm going to start over the next couple midweek rundowns, getting into some topics about college football, just some of my thoughts on the season. We'll do some college predictions here on the CFB Nation channel. But in this space, I'm going to talk about who I think are the contenders for playoff spots. And the reason why? It's because I believe Notre Dame is a contender for a playoff spot. And I will argue this, and this is partly where my excitement comes from. I believe, again, this is just my opinion based on watching film, studying other teams, all those different type of aspects, that this team, Notre Dame has had teams in the past that had playoff potential. Last year's team, if some things went correctly, had playoff potential. And we're not going to make a run once they got to the playoff. I don't care if everybody was healthy and everything went right. The 2021 team clearly had playoff potential. They were one game away for different reasons. They had playoff potential, soft schedule, veteran quarterback, some other aspects that kind of led you to, hey, I think this team has a chance to have some playoff potential. Was not a team that you looked at and said they're going to make a run. 2020 team, again, a team that had playoff potential, and they got to the playoff, but not a team you looked at and said, boy, they got a shot to go make a run. 2018 was probably the last team that I looked at, and I really felt if some things went their way, had a shot to make a run. And I believe that about this team. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I'll get into some of these aspects of it as to why I think that this it's partly part of your excitement has to come from what else is out there. Right? If we knew that there was a 2019 LSU out there or a 2018 Clemson out there, you may say, I don't know, man. Like you're going to have to catch a lot of breaks. But when you look around college football, you look at the way this Notre Dame team is constructed, I'm excited about this team. I really am. And that's the first topic that we're going to get into today. So when I look at Notre Dame in 2023, you start thinking about what are the things that go into being a championship football team. You have to have talent in your coaching staff. You have to have talent on your roster. Your schedule has to be such that you have an opportunity to get through the grind to be able to be in a position to be a playoff team. You have to be strong in certain areas, right? You have to be strong in the trenches. You have to be good at running the ball to a degree. You have to be good at stopping the run. You have to have talent in certain positions that I just think it's really hard to make a title run if you're not strong in those positions, and we'll get into those. And as I look down on them, you start thinking, man, boy, this team is positioned really well. And then in your head, you start thinking, but I don't know. Can they really compete with Ohio State? I mean, I literally in my lifetime, I've never seen Notre Dame beat Ohio State. Can they really beat Ohio State? And that's a very reasonable doubt. And then you get into some other areas and you start asking yourself, when you look at this team, you say, can they really beat Georgia? Can they really beat Bama? Can they really do those things? And we don't know the answer to that because they haven't done it, right? They haven't beaten Georgia. They've played them close twice. You look at different aspects of the offense the offense and the defense, and you say, yeah, they could this, and this, but they haven't done it. They've played Georgia twice. They've been competitive against Georgia, but competitive and fewer points at the end of the game still means you don't advance, survive and advance. When you look at Alabama, they have not even been competitive against Alabama. At least last year, they were competitive against Ohio State for most of the game. So when you dive into this team, you say, there's a lot this team has to prove. But when I look at where the team is, I also say, but if you remove all of that and you just look at the roster, you start to get excited about what this team can be and how they stack up against some other teams, and that's really where I'm at. And there was also something that kind of I had already decided to have this topic. I talked about this last week, but then you go and kind of just continue to do research, and I'm trying to disprove my theory about this football team in different aspects. And there was somebody that brought up a topic on the message board, and it was someone who's been in this chat for a long time, hasn't posted in a while, but did for a while. He's a member of the message board, and that's 99 Problems But BK1. Y'all remember him. And he did a topic where he ranked Notre Dame, Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia position by position. There's some areas that he had Notre Dame maybe a little higher than I would have, or I had Notre Dame higher than he did, or he had Bama higher than I did, or I had Bama higher than he did. And you get into it. But as you go through it, you're like, Notre Dame's not fourth and third on all those topics and all those breakdowns. And you start kind of getting into that, and you're like, look, it no matter how you stack it up, you have to say this team. Now, you don't have to. I do. I have to say, like, this team is really in position to be, put itself in position to, I should say, to make that jump. Will they do it? I don't know. But I have a confidence that they will. And I've got 10 reasons why, 9 of which are going to involve Notre Dame specifically. And then the 10th is going to be more big picture. And we'll talk about that one last. And so I'm going to go in different orders here. I'm not going to go team, offense, defense. I'm going to kind of mix it around, keep all on your toes. But there's 10 reasons why I'm excited about this Notre Dame 2023 team, and not that just they're going to be good, but this team is going to have a chance to do something that Notre Dame teams have not done in a very long time. Topic number 1, it's experience. And experience means a lot of different things. And the excitement about what the experience means is a lot of different things. For number 1, your head football coach has more experience now. Marcus Freeman has said it in an interview with me. He said it in other interviews that when you look at his role, he now is in a much better place than he was a year ago, where he said, I'm just trying to figure things out, like where to stand in practice, what side of the ball to watch. And Marcus Freeman was probably one of the most honest coaches I've ever seen, head coaches. There were times early last season where he would just be like, I don't know, or I'm not sure, or, I don't know what we're going to do next. And then to watch sort of the team just waffle through the first 6 games. I mean, 3-3 was bad enough. You lose to Stanford. It was a brutal loss. You lose to Marshall. It was a brutal loss. And I'm someone who's praised Marshall. I think Marshall is a good football team. I don't care how good Marshall is. Unless Chad Pennington and Randy Moss are on the other side of the field, you don't lose to Marshall at home. I don't care how good Marshall is. And they were a good football team last year. There were NFL caliber players on that team. Don't care. That it's Marshall, you're Notre Dame, shouldn't lose that game. Then you look at, obviously, the loss to Ohio State. It was disappointing. You at least competed. You say, hey, they nice win over Cal, nice win over North Carolina and BYU. But even within those games, there was just some sloppiness. I mean, Cal was not a very good football team, and Notre Dame let them hang around for 4 quarters. I think they trailed at halftime. BYU was a quality team, and Notre Dame jumped all over them, but then couldn't put them away. North Carolina, they're blown out, and then they just kind of sloppy fourth quarter, make that game closer than it should have been. It just wasn't a good football team. And they hit rock bottom against Stanford. And then you look at the football team and the thing say, oh, well, we're going to find out who Marcus Freeman is after this game. And we started to see who Marcus Freeman is. We saw a football team that bounced back from that loss and jumped on the next week opponent 30-7 at halftime. But again, didn't put them away. Let UNLV kind of hang around in the second half, but it was still a convincing, dominant victory. You go on the road against a ranked Syracuse team, and it's a convincing win. You go, you come back home, and you're playing a very good Clemson team, top 5 Clemson team. I believe Clemson was ranked 4th at the time, and you absolutely dominate that football team. Then you go play Navy, dominant first half, really sloppy second half, couldn't put them away. Typical what we'd seen really kind of throughout the year. Come back the next week, dominate Boston College, who was coming off of a road win over a top 25 NC State team. Go on the road, you do drop the game to USC for all the reasons we've discussed before. Then you go out in the bowl game against South Carolina and you get the win. In a game that, if not for some turnovers, you blow South Carolina out. South Carolina never has the early lead without turnovers. They never get back in the game late without turnovers. Now, turnovers are part of the game, but Notre Dame was still able to go out there and get the job done. And you say, this was still a team with flaws. Second half of the season, it was still a team with flaws. The same players that struggled to beat Stanford and Marshall and Cal were still the same players. They didn't bring anybody new. But you started to see the team buy in to what Coach Freeman was doing. You started to see Marcus Freeman sort of letting his personality out a little bit more. He's much more animated on the sideline, much more argumentative with officials. And you started to see a team play with a little bit more piss and vinegar, to take an old expression. And they were obviously a better football team. And they were a better football team in not just wins and losses, but in every statistical category, which I'll get into, especially on the defense. But when you look at the 6-1, this was different than the 2021 second half of the season. And if you all remember, in 2021, Notre Dame had a good record through the first half of the season. You know, they were 5-1 through the first 6 games, won their last 6 games, finished 11-1 in the regular season. But the first 5 games were sort of the first 6 games was the tough stretch. You had the road game against Florida State. You had Wisconsin on there. You had Cincinnati on there. You had to play it against Virginia Tech. Your last 6 games, you had a mediocre USC team whose coach got fired. You played a not very good North Carolina team. You played Navy, who wasn't very good. Virginia wasn't very good. And well, they were okay, but they were missing their quarterback and weren't great. Georgia Tech wasn't any good. Stanford wasn't any good. So, you know, you got healthy against a schedule that was soft, if we're going to be honest with you. You look at 2020 and Notre Dame played outside of Clemson and Pitt, North Carolina, 3 teams. There wasn't really any good teams on that schedule. The difference with Notre Dame's late season surge in 2022 is that it came against the toughest part of the schedule. Ohio State was the tough team early in the year, right? Obviously, that was the best team that Notre Dame played all year. But after that, you had Marshall, you had Cal, who was very undermanned. North Carolina was a good team. BYU was a quality team, but they're not as good as what they faced the second half of the year. Stanford obviously was arguably the worst team Notre Dame played all year. And then the second half of the year, you had to play Syracuse on the road, who was a ranked opponent. You had to play Clemson. You had to play USC on the road. And then, of course, you got a red-hot South Carolina team in the bowl game. So it's not like you can say, well, they got healthy against the, soft part of the schedule. That would have been if it was flipped. So let's say they would have started off like 6-1, lost to Ohio State, and then faded down the stretch. Go 3-3 in the last 6 games. You beat Boston College, you beat Navy, you beat UNLV, but you lose to Syracuse, you lose to Clemson, you lose to USC. Then you'd say, well, they beat up the teams that they're supposed to beat up. It's not the case with Notre Dame. And so you learn and you say that the head coach gained a lot of experience. The head coach was able to say, hey, look, this is what I did not do enough to get my team prepared to be successful early. I didn't do this, this, and this. We're going to fix it midstream and go do it. And now there's lessons learned. Marcus Freeman knows, okay, here's where I felt comfortable. Here's where I didn't. Here's where I need to get better. Here's where I made decisions to give coaches a little bit of leeway here. I've got to be more involved in making sure that we're all going in the same direction. Got to make sure the players are buying into things. I got to make sure there's more consistency in our approach and our motto and our themes and all those type of aspects. And he's got a lot more experience. But it's not just Marcus Freeman. You've got more experience on offense. I mean, think about the bowl game. Notre Dame started 8 true sophomores on offense in the bowl game last year. 8 true sophomores. Now, one of them's gone. Obviously, Tyler Buckner left. But now all those sophomores are a year older. You've got, well, actually, Lorenzo Styles also left, but Audric Estime is a junior now. You're likely one of your best starting receivers outside of Tobias Merriweather are going to be third and fourth year players. Matt Salerno is a fifth, sixth year guy. Jaden Thomas is a junior with a whole year under his belt. Deion Colsey's now a junior. Chris Tyree is a senior. They're going to be a lot older there. Mitchell Evans is now a junior. He started in the bowl game. I said Estime is going to be a junior. You went from having a redshirt sophomore quarterback that didn't have played a whole lot of football to now you have a sixth-year senior who's one of the most prolific passers in college football history. Blake Fisher's now a junior. Joe Walt's now a junior. Zeke Correll was an older player last year as a senior, but hadn't played a ton of football coming into that season. He's a lot more experienced. So now instead of being really young at your tackles, really young in the perimeter, really young in the backfield, really young and inexperienced at quarterback, you have a much more experienced football team that's been through it. Defensively, it's the same way. This is probably the deepest Notre Dame defensive football team I've seen in a very long time. And I'll get into that a little bit more specifically. But with that comes, and I don't mean deep just in numbers, I'm talking about depth from guys that have played. So I'll talk later about depth of talent. I'm talking now depth from an experience standpoint. You look up the middle, 3 of your top 4 returners up the middle have played a lot of football. You have defensive ends. Your starting ends have played a lot of football. Your big ends have played a lot of football. You returned 3 starters at linebacker. You returned 2 starters at corner. You're arguably the guy that can end up being your number 4 corner this year and backup nickel is a guy that in 2020 was a starter on a Notre Dame playoff team. And he's now your 3rd or 4th corner at best. You've got a lot of experience coming back at safety this season. 6th-year senior DJ Brown. Ramon Henderson's a senior now. Xavier Watts a senior now. So there's a ton of experience. And even though there's a new offensive coordinator, it's not a new coach. It's someone that's been there. So you have a lot of experience coming back in the coaching staff as well. And unlike last year at a couple spots, the new coaches that you're adding are veteran guys. Right? Marty Biagi's a veteran guy on the special teams. Then on offense, Gino Gadulli's a veteran. Joe Rudolph's definitely a veteran. So you're a very experienced football team in a lot of ways, and that's a big reason why I'm excited about this Notre Dame football team. I think you can win with younger players, but your younger players have to be the exception. You look at Clemson in 2018, freshman quarterback, sophomore running back, true freshman receiver that was really good, true sophomore receiver that was really good. But you also had a lot of experience in other places. The line was very experienced. Hunter Renfro was very experienced. You had a ton of experience on defense. And so that team could mix in some, hey, we're young here and there, but we're still a really experienced football team overall. And that's how Notre Dame should be this year. Reason number 2 that I'm excited about this football team, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this one because we've already spent a lot of time on it. It's the rival Sam Hartman. I don't know how good Sam Hartman is going to be this year. There's a lot of expectations. Always going to throw for. We're discussing yesterday in our mailbag. Can he throw for 4,000 yards or not? We'll see. I don't know that he has to. Is he going to be a guy that's a Heisman contender? I don't know. We'll find out. There's a lot of questions that you have with Sam Hartman, but the one thing that is this is a very experienced quarterback that is a significant upgrade over what Notre Dame has had at the position in recent seasons. We saw that the last time Notre Dame got a transfer quarterback 2 years ago in Jack Cohn, that played a huge role in Notre Dame's success that season. When you have a game, and the perfect example is this. You compare the loss to Marshall in 2022 with the win over Toledo in 2021. And to me, that shows you the biggest difference between the 2022 team and the 2021 team is because there was a difference in experience at quarterback. So when you look at the game last year against Marshall, obviously Notre Dame struggled that game, had some issues, really couldn't put Marshall away. You were losing 9-7 at halftime, 12-7 going into the fourth quarter. But in the fourth quarter, you come out and you have you have a touchdown drive, right? And then you kind of go back and forth. You miss some opportunities. Marshall goes down and scores with, what was it? I think 5 minutes left to go up 19-15. Defense fails to make some stops. had a chance to really stop Marshall deep in their own territory, couldn't get it done. They go on a 94-yard drive, take 5 minutes off the clock. So what does Notre Dame do in response? They throw a pick six on the very next possession, I think third play of the series, and it's game over. They end up getting a touchdown late to make it close, and you lose the game 26-21. Reminds me a lot of the Toledo game the year before. Notre Dame's losing 16-14 at halftime. They go scoreless in the fourth quarter. Notre Dame's losing. They score early in the fourth quarter to take a 17-16 lead. The defense makes a stop. The offense goes up. They score on one play. Chris Tyree on a wheel route. The very next play, the first play of the next series, you go up 24-16. But you can't put them away. Toledo comes right down the field. They go on a 6-play, 89-yard drive. Your offense, I think they fumbled, right? Didn't Kyron Williams fumble the ball, if I remember correctly? I'm trying to remember what happened that gave them the ball back. Yes, it was a Kyron Williams fumble against Toledo. Toledo gets the ball back. They go down and score. They make it 29-24 with 1:35 left. What does Notre Dame do? They immediately respond. You have a veteran quarterback whose finger gets dislocated right in the middle of the drive, goes over, quickly has him fix it, comes in and throws a touchdown drive. You had that veteran presence that could calm everybody down and say, we're going to be all right. Let's just go do our thing. Let's go make our plays. He led them down the field, and they scored a touchdown. Whereas in this season, you're asking a redshirt freshman, basically, who had not played a lot of football, to go out there and say, hey, we need you to go win us a game. And Tyler Buckner wasn't ready for it. He didn't have the experience for it. Jack Cohn was able to. You look at a game like that, and you think, hey, having that veteran presence is why you win that football game. We saw that several times in 2021. What happens if Notre Dame has a redshirt freshman quarterback against Florida State when you blow a lead and allow them to come back and get in that game, tie it, send it to overtime? What happens? You have a veteran quarterback, you're fine. He gets you out of that game. You get into situations where you look at other contests. North Carolina defense is really struggling. Can't make stops, kind of like the USC game this past season. Quarterback settles everybody down. We're going to be fine. Go out there and you make all the answers that you need to make. Having that type of veteran presence can be a big difference between when you're losing games like they were losing last year or in 2022 and then winning those games in 2021. So when you look at it from that standpoint alone, that experience is going to give you an opportunity to go out and win some of those games that in other years with less experience you would learn. And so number two partly also ties into number one, but it's also about you have a guy that's played on the big stages. He's played against Clemson. He's played in an ACC title game. He started, I think, like 3 bowl games at this point in time in his career. And you say, this is a guy that gives you something that you didn't have last year and gives you more ability than what you had Jack Cohn. And you all know I was a big Jack Cohn fan. I love that pickup. I thought that was big for Notre Dame. But Sam Hartman, to me, brings even more experience. Jack Cohn had about 3,000 career passing yards coming into that game. Sam Hartman has over 12,000. I think Jack Cohn had 20-some touchdowns in his career coming into that season. Sam Hartman has 110 passing touchdowns. So even as good as Jack Cohn was, this isn't even a bigger jump in what you're bringing into the table. And to be honest, I don't know if this is arguable. If you look at the talent around him, Sam Hartman also walks into a much better situation with the talent around him than what Jack Cohn walked in 2021. And I think that's just another reason why I'm very excited about this football team is the presence of Sam Hartman. Appreciate you all bearing with me a little bit today. Obviously, it's just me talking, so I don't have those normal breaks in between when somebody else is talking to get my drinks in to loosen my throat up. So I appreciate that patience. Reason number 3 that I'm excited about this Notre Dame football team, and this is probably the one that's going to bring the most disagreement from some, and that's fair, but it's how the defense played in the second half of the 2022 season. I understand the concerns and frustrations with Al Golden. I've expressed a lot of them. But I think those frustrations and concerns have taken a life of their own, and they've gone way too far. and we are failing. We are remembering Stanford and second half of Ohio State and Marshall and those games, and we're ignoring what we saw the second half of the year, including the USC game. And when I've been doing film study the second half of the season or of the season, and I look at the second half and I see the team playing better football against a very good schedule, because the one thing you got to say about the defense in the second half is they did play some pretty good offenses. They didn't always play great, but they did play some pretty good offenses. So when you look at the stats that I'm about to bring up to you, it gives you the right context to say that's pretty good. And what I try to avoid is making comparisons about stretches where if you can have this, if you can, take these 2 games and stretch it out over 12, they're pretty good. That's not really how it is, because otherwise you could say, if you could take 2 games from last year and take that over the course of an entire season, then Spencer Rattler's the best quarterback in college football, right? I mean, did you watch him against Tennessee and Clemson when he threw for 798 yards and 8 touchdowns and completed over 70% of his passes in 2 games? No, that's not how it works. You have to look at it, to me, in longer stretches, right? It's over the course of 5, 6, 7 games. And so as I'm breaking down the film of the defense this summer, and I'm like, man, like this is better, really than I thought when you're kind of in the emotion of the season. Then you start looking at the numbers. And you start looking at Riley Mills' production in the second half of the year when he was moved inside. You start looking at J.D. Bertrand's production, which I talked about on on a couple shows here recently. You start looking at what Cam Hart was doing, not production-wise, but just the fact that he wasn't producing anything because people just stopped throwing at him. Clemson tried early in the first half, and it didn't work out real well for him. You look at what Benjamin Morrison didn't really have his breakout till – I'd say the second half of the Syracuse game. He was good up till then, but the second half of the Syracuse game, they had beat him for a touchdown early. He got called for a penalty, and then he really buckled in, finished that game real strong, and then, of course, finished the season on an extremely high note. But if you look at Notre Dame's numbers in the last half of the season, the last 6 games against non-option teams, because I think option teams skew numbers. They skew numbers in the wrong direction from a run game standpoint, and then they skew numbers in the wrong direction positively when you're looking at pass game numbers. For example, last year when you look at Notre Dame, if I were to type in or factor in what Notre Dame did from a pass defense standpoint against Navy, well, their numbers are going to look a whole lot better. You held your opponent under 50%. You only gave up 108 yards of passing. Well, that doesn't really tell the story of how you played because of the nature of who they play. So I did take out Navy to show you the context of what I'm referring to here. But when you look at Notre Dame's last 6 games, and this is what they were. So I went total defense, which is the first category you're going to see on this graph, rushing yards per game, passing yards per game, tackles for loss per game, sacks per game, and then also within defense, rushing, and passing, I also put yards per play, because as you all know, I'm a big yards per play guy, and I think it puts things in a proper context, and that right there you'll see in the rushing and passing, that it gives very important context to what we've seen. And so when you think about some of the frustration that we as fans had about the season last year, it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to say they've got to get better, but it's not okay, in my opinion, if you're just going to ignore in an entire half of the season and look at their numbers. So let's look at what Notre Dame did in the last 6 games of the season against non-option teams. So it really begins with UNLV on. So coming out of the Stanford game, this is what they did. And I think this leads to the experience thing about what Marcus Freeman is going to do. The Notre Dame defense gave up 304.5 yards per game of total of that's what they allowed per game from the opposing offenses. These ranks that I have next to it are what they would rank over the course of the season with those numbers. And I'm not one of those people who's like, well, this shows that they will do that this year. It's just for context, to allow you to see the context. Okay. And so even down in the chat now, people are talking about just ignoring the number. Hey, appreciate the numbers, but I'm not going to believe anything you're about to tell me because I have this apprehension about this thing that, your numbers prove are not accurate. I get that, but this is what the numbers are. Despite having Caleb Williams on the schedule, Clemson on the schedule, South Carolina on the schedule, who's scoring 50 points a game coming into that bowl game. So Notre Dame defense gives up 304.5 yards per game, which would rank them 12th. in the country last year. 4.8 yards per play would rank them 14th. If you look at Notre Dame's last 5 seasons, the only year that was close to that level of production was 2019 when they gave up 320.2. The 2018 defense, which fueled a 12-0 season, that was fueled off of the defense. They gave up 347.4. The yards per play in 19 and 18 were slightly better, 0.1 better, 4.7 compared to 4.8. So from a total defense standpoint, Notre Dame played outstanding football in the last 6 games of the season. The story is also true for the rush defense. Notre Dame gave up 103.7 yards per game in the last 6 games against non-option teams, and that included over 200 yards against USC, allowed 3.6 yards per carry. Now, the yards per game number would rank 14th in the country. The yards per attempt number would rank 28th. Now, that's an area where you want to see it get even better. You want to be in that top 15 in yards per play. If you want to really get into some caveats to try to skew the numbers, what I could have done is I could have taken out the UNLV game where they gave up 4.7 yards. They gave up 5.2 yards per play because UNLV had a 70-yard run in that game. And you say that skews the numbers. You take that out, and all of a sudden the rushing numbers drop down a ton. But I don't think that's fair to do. You can't just take out this play, that play, the other play, because then that you can tell whatever story you want, and I don't think that's as fair. I think Navy is a reasonable one to take out for different options, for different reasons, I should say. But I think the other things you have to put in. So even with that performance against UNLV, you're talking about a team that gave up 103.7 yards per game. In those last 6 games, 4 of Notre Dame's 6 opponents were held to 90 rushing yards or less, and 3 of those opponents, that includes Clemson, who was at 90, 3 of those opponents, Syracuse, Boston College, and South Carolina, were held to 65 rushing yards or less. And that's obviously where you want to be. If Notre Dame did this over the course of an entire season, they'd be pretty good. And the reason that I think this is the number to even be the most excited about than any of the other numbers is because this is the one that, to me, you can most count on potentially replicating in 2023. Because most of the players that were responsible for that level of production are back. Isaiah Foskey was a good player against the run, but I don't think he was the reason your run defense was this good. Up the middle, you were very good. Riley Mills played a lot more inside the second half of the season. I think that factored. We saw a lot more of Jordan Patelho second half of the season. The linebackers are all back from last season. You started to see more and more Xavier Watts and Ramon Henderson in the second half of the season, along with DJ Brown, a little less Houston Griffith, a lot less Brandon Joseph. And they went out and they're all back. Your corners are all back. A big chunk of what was responsible for this production is there. And I would argue that the one game that they didn't do well against the run in the second half of the year against USC is because they went away from what worked. They didn't run the same defense. They didn't utilize the same talent. They went away from what worked, and USC gashed them. I would argue if you stay with what you do, you'd have been better. Now, the counter argument is, yeah, but you didn't have Cam Hart and Tariq Bracy. It would have been harder to do that, to defend the pass game then. And obviously Notre Dame had to kind of pick their poison, and they picked trying to stop the pass, and we saw what USC was able to do. The pass game numbers were good. Gave up 200.8 yards per game against the pass last year, which would have ranked them 27th. But the yards per attempt would have ranked 7th and was lower than anything we've seen since 19 and 18 when Notre Dame had a top 5 yards per attempt defense in 19 and 18. So last year's pass defense was very, very close to what we saw from the really, really good Notre Dame defenses that helped fuel a playoff run in 2018. And if you look at the yards per attempt in the second half of the season, UNLV was at 4.6, Syracuse was at 6.3, Clemson was at 4.8, BC was at 5.3, South Carolina was at 5.9, and then, of course, you give up 10.5 against USC. That's the one that's got to get better. Tackles for loss. This was the one that actually surprised me a little bit. I knew that Notre Dame was more disruptive in the second half of the season, but I didn't know that they were this disruptive in the second half of the season. When you look at their tackles for loss and sack numbers in the last 6 games, again, against non-option teams, Notre Dame would have ranked 5th in tackles for loss and 3rd in sacks. That's a really, really impressive number. And I think it's something that kind of got me a little bit fired up about what this defense could be. Because again, with the exception of Foskey, who was very good in the second half of the year, or at least very productive second half of the year, everybody that's responsible for that is back. And we've also seen this team play a game without Isaiah Foskey when it comes to this. And that was the bowl game against South Carolina. They had 9 tackles for loss in the bowl game against South Carolina, and they had 3 sacks in the bowl game against South Carolina. So their disruption numbers were every bit as good against South Carolina as they were against anybody else. And if you look at quarterback hurries and kind of how the NCAA looks at those, they had 8 hurries in that game, which was the most they had all season. The most they had previously was 5 against Cal, Syracuse, and Boston College. So even without Foskey, and this is partly where the excitement comes from, and you say, well, how are they going to do without Foskey? Well, we have seen an example of that. We have seen an example of what they lost. And everybody talks about all the players South Carolina didn't have in that game. Outside of their tight end, almost all the other impact players that sat out that game were on South Carolina's defense, not their offense. And so when you look at that, you say, boy, yeah, that's something that you feel you can translate to a degree because all the players that were responsible for that are back. And you didn't even have Cam Hart at the time. So I think those are all things that you look at and say, this isn't something that Notre Dame did in a month or in a 3-game stretch. This is what they did off the entire second half of the season. Coming out of the Stanford game, everything that followed Stanford game outside of Navy, the bowl game, all of it's included. You played 3 ranked opponents during that stretch. You played 4 ranked opponents in that 6-game stretch. So that's the other thing too. 4 of the 6 teams you played during this stretch where Notre Dame put up these kind of outstanding top 15 to top 10 caliber numbers on defense came during a stretch where 4 of your 6 opponents were ranked at the time you played, and 3 of your 6 opponents finished the year ranked in the top 25. Number 12, number 13, and number 23. The number 23 team that you beat at the end of the season was coming off wins over Tennessee and Clemson, who finished the year ranked 6th and 13th. And so those are just different things to me that when I look at this defense, you say what they did to finish the 2022 season, to me, is the same kind of thing we saw in past seasons that said, hey, there's something coming here, right? When certain aspects of your football team finish the season on a very strong note, a lot of times when a lot of that talent comes back, you start kind of saying, hey, this is something I think is translatable into next season. And I think those are things that can get you fired up about what this football team is going to be. And we've seen this in the past. This isn't me looking for a reach. This is something we've seen in the past. When you look at Notre Dame in 2014, for all their woes in 2014, Notre Dame had some moments late in the season in 2014 where they started to look like they could run the football really well. And they come out obviously in 2015, and that's exactly who they are. They're running the football very well. You look at the 2016 season, as bad as that year was, down the stretch, Notre Dame ran for 261, 200, and 154 yards against USC. They would have ran for more against USC, but they fell behind late and had to throw the football a lot. And you say, boy, this team has the makings of, if they can just do a couple things, this run game could be really good next year. And that's exactly what it was. Notre Dame that season, or in 2016, rushes for 163 yards a game. The next season, with the same personnel that finished strong, they come out and run for 269.3 yards per game, despite losing a second-round draft pick at quarterback. So you see these trends. So what you look for is, did they finish the year with a level of consistency in areas, and are the majority of the players that were responsible for that, and the majority of the coaches that were responsible for that, are they back? I think when you look at Notre Dame, that's true. And that's a big reason why I'm excited about this Notre Dame football team is the data that exists and the trends that exist to make you think this is certainly something that they can carry over into the 2023 season. Let's talk about the number 4 reason that I'm excited about this football team. And I think this is one that a lot of us are going to agree on. Notre Dame is an offensive line-driven football team, according to their head coach, Marcus Freeman, and they're going to have a very good offensive line coming back this season. You talk about arguably the best tackle tandem in college football. You have a veteran at center, and you have some very young, talented, up-and-coming players at guard that are now going to be surrounded by much more veteran players. Last year, Blake Fisher and Joe Alt just kind of had to worry about themselves. Get yourself going. You're just a sophomore. You worry about you. Now they're juniors. Now they both have double-digit starts under their belt, and they have an opportunity now to be leaders. And everything I've heard about these guys, they're putting in the work this offseason, and there's a lot of expectations. Zeke Correll obviously coming back. Billy Schrouth has no experience, but he's a guy that is loads of talent and quickly emerged in the spring as the best guard on the team during the spring. So there's a lot of excitement there. There's a great battle at right guard. Whenever there's a battle between good players, you start to feel confident that, well, someone's going to win that job and they're going to be in a good position. So I think the fact that this is an O-line driven football team has me excited. It's a different ways, right? Like there's you can have a good football team and a good veteran group of guys that maybe might not be dominant, but they're just going to be consistent. But are they going to be good enough to perform one of those big games? And with Notre Dame, we've got to find out if they can perform consistently effective in the big games, which last year, early in the season, didn't play well against Ohio State. I thought the offensive line played pretty well in the other two big games. The other big games they had last season, obviously played great against Syracuse, which was a must-win game for Notre Dame. You're 4-3. You're struggling. You're playing a ranked opponent on the team, and you go out and your offense dominates in the trenches, just absolutely dominated Syracuse in the trenches. You go out the next week, you do the same thing in Clemson. I actually think the offensive line played better than most people give them credit for against USC. I think that was USC basically saying, we're going to put more in the box than you can block, and we're going to make Drew Pine beat us, and we're going to make your receivers beat us, and they couldn't. They weren't good enough to do that. But I thought the offensive line did some good things in that game, and then, of course, they played phenomenal against South Carolina. So we saw a unit that was absolutely trending in the right direction late in the season, played at a very high level. You bring an All-American back at left tackle. You bring a very experienced kid with lots of talent at right tackle. You have a veteran center, and you've got a battle between some big physical kids inside. And I think one thing that I expect to see this year is I do think there's a chance, depending on who wins certain jobs, that you could be even more physical inside than you were last season. Jared Patterson was an athletic kid that was about angles and doing his job, but he wasn't that mauler type. Billy Schrouth brings that potential. Right guard Josh Lugg did a really nice job. Do your job. Just had a really good final season at Notre Dame. Depending on who wins that job, you might have a guy that has a little bit more pop when he's playing in the run game. We'll have to see. But there's a lot of good depth. I'll have an intel piece. I'm halfway done writing it. I had to stop to do the show, but I'm halfway through an intel piece on the offense that's going to be on the board. I'm talking about running backs and receivers. I'm going to have another one coming out tomorrow that's going to dive more into the offensive line and tight ends. I'm just waiting to hear back from another source that I like to talk to about offensive line play before I dive into that. But what I've heard so far about Tosh Baker is very positive about the season that the offseason that he's had. So when you look at the Notre Dame offensive line, they want to be an offensive line driven team. They have the talent to be that. They have the desire to be that. I think we saw that during the spring and the way that they finished in the spring game, in the scrimmage before the spring game. So the Jersey scrimmage, I heard a lot of good things about what the offensive line looked like in that game and what the expectations are. And then also how quickly they're adapting to Joe Rudolph. That was a big question, right? Like you lose Harry Hiestand, you lose a legend, one of the best in the business who inherited a train wreck and by the end of the season turned it into one of the best lines in college football. You lose that, okay, what's going to replace him? And will the players have the same buy-in with him that they have with Coach Hiestand? And from everything I've heard so far, they do have the same buy-in because Coach Rudolph's fundamentals, his MITs, right, his most important things are the same as what Coach Hiestand preached. He just does it in a different way. And so there's been a lot of buy-in in that regard. And so I feel very confident that the Notre Dame offensive line is going to be a championship caliber unit. And I don't believe that Notre Dame can't beat Clemson. Meaning they can't have a team that's just so good at the skill positions and so good on defense that you can just have a solid line and win a championship. I don't think Notre Dame can win that way. They need a dominant line, and I think this team has a chance to have a dominant line, which is another reason why I'm excited about this Notre Dame football team. My number 5 reason why I'm excited about this football team, it's perimeter talent on defense. Brian Smith has had stuff like this in the past. He's broken this down. Brian Smith, obviously, as you all know, he's been on our show a bunch of times. He has a new show on CFB Nation that talks about Southeastern recruiting. And he has always pointed out that to win championships, you have to have talent on the perimeter of your defense, and that's mainly cornerback. Cornerback, and I would even expand it now, even beyond what Brian has done, because of the nature of how the game has evolved since Brian a couple years ago did that breakdown at Irish Breakdown. Is I think even more now you have to have also a nickel, and so you have to have some really big time talent on the perimeter to be a championship football team. And if you look at most of the champions in recent seasons, that's exactly what they've had. Obviously, Georgia last season had very good talent on the perimeter defense. You had Keely Ringo at corner. I believe their other corner was Kamari Lassiter, very talented football player. 2020, Alabama had very good talent at corner. Patrick Surtain, who's now a star cornerback for the Broncos. LSU in 2019 didn't necessarily have an elite defense that season, but they were pretty good at corner. When you look at Derek Stingley Jr., Christian Fulton, they had big-time corners. 2018, Clemson has Trayvon Mullen and A.J. Terrell. They were outstanding. So when you go down through the years, you realize that is something that has been an ingredient to championship football teams. And I don't know that we can sit here and say, well, but Notre Dame can be so good at other positions that they can completely break the trend of what's needed to be a championship football team. I don't believe that to be true. I mean, look at Alabama's 2017 team and the players they had in 2017 with Minkah Fitzpatrick, who was kind of a do-it-all type of guy. So I really believe that is something that is necessary to have a championship defense is talent on the perimeter, slot guys, outside guys that can play the pass. Notre Dame's corner tandem of Benjamin Morrison and Cam Hart has a chance to be one of the nation's best, if not the best cornerbacks. They still have something to prove to be that, but statistically, they are among the best. I've done breakdowns on this to show how they stack up against other teams, considered the other best cornerback tandems. Benjamin Morrison and Cam Hart last year held opponents to sub 50% completion rate last year. That is not something that Troy Pride and Julian Love did in 2018. And that was a championship caliber cornerback tandem in 2018. But when you look at the difference between last year and the year before, Benjamin Morrison, for example, last season held opponents to, I think it was 43% completion rate. Let me find it here real quick. Yeah, 43.1% completion rate. If you look at Cam Hart, he was right at 50. So 50% completion rate. And then you look at Notre Dame's outstanding cornerback duo in 2018, which I think we all believe was very, very good. And you'll see that they were not there. Julian Love allowed 53.2% completions, and Troy Pride allowed 57.9% completions in those seasons. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited about what the Notre Dame Duke group can bring to the table. Now, are there areas that got to get better? Absolutely. But I think that you're going to see a tandem that is one of the best. You've got Jaden Mickey's now a year older. Chance Tucker's now a year older. You add Christian Gray, who those that read the intel piece on the defense know is absolutely making his presence felt this summer now that he's back to being healthy. And none of those guys are your fastest guy. That's Micah Bell, who also arrived this summer. So the cornerback room is as good as it's been in a long time, because the difference in 2018 and 2023 is in 2018, because Dante Vaughn was just never healthy with the knee problems, the back problems, all the different issues. He was never the same guy that he was as a freshman when he was arguably their best cornerback. But after that, those two starters, there was a big drop off. You had Dante Vaughn, and then true freshman Tariq Bracy, and then just you were tapped out. This team is in better position to where if there is an injury, God forbid, that you're in a position where you can put a Jaden Mickey in the game, a Chance Tucker in the game, maybe even a Christian Gray in the game, and say Clarence Lewis, a guy who started in a playoff game for Notre Dame, and you say that they're going to be okay. They're going to be fine there if something happens like what happened in 2018 when Julian Love got knocked out for almost a full half. So I think that's something that you start to get fired up about, that Notre Dame has the perimeter talent and depth of talent, something you're going to hear me talk about again, to be outstanding on the perimeter. And that is the next part of what I want to talk about. The depth of talent on the defense is a very underrated part of this football team and what I think this football team is going to be like and why my expectations are the way that they are. Depth and depth of talent are two different things. You can be a deep football team because you have a lot of quality veteran players, but that doesn't mean you have a lot of talent. You can have a group of starters that are pretty good, and your backups are veterans, fifth-year guys, junior guys, team guys, rah-rah guys. Hey, I can get you out of the game. I can go in there and do enough to get you out of the game because I know what I'm doing. I know where to line up. I know what the offense is trying to do. I'm just that kind of guy. Then there's the teams, and this is true when you look at Clemson in 2018. You look at Georgia the last 2 years. You look at some of the teams that have won because their defense was dominant. And it wasn't just a situation where you had good starters, but you could throw waves of players at people on all three levels. And Notre Dame has the talent to do that. Now, there's a lot of unprovenness to some of this depth, which is why it's not so. I mean, we talked about the experience early. There's a lot of guys that have played a lot of football, but there's also a lot of very talented younger players that haven't that are going to get opportunities. Junior Talamaka, Josh Burnham, Jason Onye, Donovan Heinisch. You look at linebacker Nolan Ziegler, Jalen Sneed. Those are guys that haven't played a ton of football. Christian Gray hasn't played a lot of football. Chance Tucker hasn't played a lot of football. So there are some guys that this year are going to be fighting for number 2 jobs in rotation roles that haven't played a lot of football, but they're talented. Jason Onye has not played. I mean, he's got like a couple career snaps. That's it. But he's very talented, and we saw that in the spring. Gabriel Rubio's now a junior. He's a guy that I was talking with somebody the other day, and the comment to me was, if you took the backup defensive line for Notre Dame, so Junior Talamaka or Josh Burnham, whoever's not the starter at big end, whether it's Nana or Javonte Jean-Baptiste, and you took the number 2 tackles, Gabriel Rubio and Jason Onye, that's probably the starting D line for over half the teams that Notre Dame's going to play this year. It's not true for Clemson. It's not true for Ohio State. It's not true for some of the better teams, but for most teams on your schedule, over half, I would argue that this is a defensive line that would start, or most of those guys would start on Notre Dame opponents. It's been a long time. You think about how great that 2012 Notre Dame defensive line was. Lewis Nix, Stephon Tuitt, Capron Lewis Moore, Print Shembo. But then there was a drop-off in the number 2s. It's Tony Springman. It was Kona Schwenke. Guys who are good, solid depth players, but they weren't impact guys. Sheldon Day was part of that rotation too, but he was a true freshman. Then you look at now, and it's some of these guys that are going to be number 2 roles are guys that could start at other places or that will at least push the veterans. And there's 2 reasons why I think this is important. Number 1, to have a linebacking core, if the veterans still start, you now have a situation where you can throw Nolan Ziegler and Jalen Sneed and Drake Bowen and possibly Jaden Osbury at teams as part of rotation or nickel packages or whatever the case may be. Defensive line-wise, you can throw Rubio at people, Onye at people. Donovan Heinisch has had a great offseason. Tyson Ford is a guy that's got a chance to be that kind of guy. Josh Burnham might be your pound-for-pound best athlete on the entire defense, if not the team. So you're starting to talk about, you're throwing some athletes at people. You're throwing some talented players at people. Notre Dame's going to have 4-star top 200 guys fighting to even get in the rotation this year on defense if you're someone who cares about recruiting rankings. I don't as much. I care about talent, and I see talent. And I think that's something that's different. I believe that's something that's different with this football team on defense is they're not if this guy goes down, you are screwed situation. I think at safety, if one of the 4 goes down, you're in a little bit more trouble from a depth standpoint because now you have to play freshmen. Now you have to put Ben Minnick in the field or Don Schuler on the field. But right now, they're in a good place. And Ben Minnick is a guy that, from what I'm told, is going to have a chance to push the 4 veterans ahead of him just by his play. So there's a lot of excitement about the depth of the talent on the defense, and it's another reason why I'm excited about this football team heading into 2023. So that's reason number 6. Reason number 7, and this is a similar type of topic on offense, and that's the diversity of the skill at Notre Dame on offense. I think when you look at some of the great Notre Dame teams in the past, you look at the thing of the 2018 team, the 2020 team that were really good teams. There was a lot of this is the same guy. You know, you look at receiver, yeah, you had Chris Fink in the slot, but you had Miles Boykin and Chase Claypool outside. That you had 2 types of receivers, and that was really it. Your running backs were all kind of doing the same stuff. One of the things that excites me about this football team is you have such a unique group of skill sets. So you have Audric Estime and what he brings to the table in one breath. And I think like Jabron Payne kind of falls into that mold to a degree, but he's got a little bit more elusiveness. Then you counter that with the explosiveness of guys like Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love, and wait till you all hear the updates in my intel piece on those 2 guys. I can't wait to finish writing it, and I'm going to get that out. It'll come out this evening after the show, and I get this edited and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of excitement about them. And then there's that juice there. There's the hammers at other positions. Then there's Devin Ford, who's a slasher. You look at wide receiver, you've got Tobias Merriweather, tall, long, vertical guy, good route runner, great ball skills. And you got a big physical guy like Jaden Thomas, who's 6'2", 220. Some people think he's a tight end. He's not, but it's just the unique skill set. Deion Colsey, big 6'5", fast, vertical. You think, okay, those are somewhat similar skill sets, but then you throw out a Chris Tyree at him. Rico Flores is a completely different player than those guys. Jaden Greathouse is a completely different player from those guys. Braylon James is a completely different player from those guys. Matt Salerno is a completely different player from those guys. There's a lot of different skills. And then Chris Tyree and Jaden Greathouse, who are different than the bigger guys, they're different from each other. And Chris Tyree being the fast, short, speedy guy that get the space guy. Jaden Greathouse more of a route runner, great contested catch guy. So there's a lot of different aspects to be excited about, but you can't game plan for a type of guy. And here's why this is important. If you go play a team, like let's take Ohio State, for example. Ohio State has long corners. Denzel Burke's a really long kid. The transfer they got from Ole Miss is a very long kid. They have long corners. Let's say that Ohio State's corners can come out and say, hey, we're long enough to match up with your big receivers. Well, Notre Dame doesn't just have to keep going with that. They can do things in 12 personnel to get Ohio State into different matchups. They can throw a Chris Tyree in a situation. They can use the size to, their size to, okay, well, we can't necessarily get a bunch of separation in the pass game, but we can do some things in the run game to where, yeah, they may be as long to compete with us, but we still got 20, 30 pounds on them, at least from a weight standpoint, where we can now do some things in the run game, get Chris Tyree out there, all that different stuff. And so I think those are aspects that you say, the fact that you can match up based on what other teams are good at or not good at. If you have a team that has a smaller nickel, you can go with Jaden Thomas in the slot. You can go with Jaden Greathouse in the slot. If you have a team that's got a longer corner, you can say, hey, look, there's some things we can do as an offense to get Chris Tyree moving around to where he can get in space and he's not going to be getting rerouted by this longer nickel. Now that guy's got to chase Chris Tyree and he just can't do it because he doesn't run well enough. That unique skill set, same with the backfield. You can go 21 and 20 personnel, and whether it's Jadarian Price or Jeremiah Love or Jabron Payne, those guys can move around and do different things to where you're not just going 21 personnel with Logan Diggs and Audric Estime, who are kind of the same guy, right? You're putting different skill sets on the field. Even a tight end this year, when you had Mitchell Evans and Michael Mayer on the field, you had 2 guys that were very similar in how you used them. They're not the same player, but the concepts that you use them for, they're taller, possession guys, good route runners, good blockers. There's not a lot of variety there. Now you have Mitchell Evans and Holden Stace, and they're 2 completely different players. And if Eli Raridan is able to come back at some point in time healthy, and we'll see if that's the case, and I'll have some stuff on him too, that's a 6'7" kid that's fast. And so he's a different, he can do some of the things that Mitchell Evans can do, but then he also can do some things that Mitchell Evans can't do just from a pure speed standpoint. So you have 3 tight ends there that to me bring very different skill sets. Then you have a freshman like Cooper Flanagan, who may not do a whole lot in the pass game early, but is a kid that can kind of come in and right now compete in the run game, be ready to compete in the run game. So there's just a uniqueness to your skill set that reminds me a lot of the 2020 tight end room. But now I think you're in a situation where you have a coordinator that will a little bit better use those different weapons, I believe, in the pass game as not just only relying on the number one. So I think the diversity of skill on offense is something that has me very excited because, again, it's hard to slump when you have the depth that Notre Dame has on offense and the depth of from a diversity standpoint, right? The I should say depth of but the diversity that you have. So teams that can stop this may not be able to stop that. There aren't many teams that can stop all of it, right? And I think that's something you get excited about because if a certain thing isn't working, you have something to go to. If the run game wasn't working for him in the past, you're in trouble. If the big receivers couldn't get open in the past, you're in trouble. This team has buttons they can push to be in those situations and be effective. And I think that's something also that has me excited about this Notre Dame football team in 2023. Let's dive into my eighth reason I'm excited about the Notre Dame football team heading into 2023, and that's the potential of the front seven, especially the front four. I think this is one of the most. We had a question yesterday at the end of the chat that we didn't get a chance to go to, and I believe the question had something to do with what's the position group with the most boomer bust potential on the team. And my inkling at the time was I probably, if I would have answered it yesterday, I might have said receiver. But as you really think about it, I really believe it could be the defensive line. Not because the reason I would say I don't love the phrasing of boomer bust, because I don't think there's any scenario in which these guys bust because we've all seen them. But when you look at it and say the floor is not super high, but it's high enough to where you're a 9-win team, but the ceiling for this defensive line is incredibly high. That's also part of the reason why this is a little bit further down on my list is because it's one of the more unknowns. I'm confident in the first 7 things, like real confident. This is one of those ones that I'm a little uncertain of as far as will it happen, but there's no disputing the talent. Will Riley Mills break out this year? I don't know. Do I have any doubt that Riley Mills is talented? None. He's a kid that's 6'5". He's 300 plus. He's about 300 pounds now. I hear from multiple sources that that's the guy that NFL teams ask Notre Dame about the most when they call and reach out. Ryan has confirmed this too on his end, that he's a guy that a lot of NFL people have reached out to him in the past. He's long, he's athletic. His production on a per snap basis as an interior player is significantly greater than what you saw from Jerry Tillery and Sheldon Day going into their senior seasons. And I did this kind of thought experiment the other day. The year that Jerry Tillery was an All-American, first-team All-American, he had 10.5 tackles for loss and 8 sacks. If you took Riley Mills' production from last season as an interior player and project that to the same number of snaps that Jerry Tillery had, he'd have 16 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. That's a heck of a season. If you project it to the number of productions Sheldon Day had in his final season when he had 15 tackles for loss and 4.5 sacks, Riley would have been a 9-5 guy. Not quite the same level, but still a pretty good season for a 3 technique. I think Riley has a chance to be kind of in between those two. He's not going to get to 16. I mean, I'd be shocked by that. I think he could have a chance to have more than 9. I think he's a guy that has a chance to be a double-digit tackle for loss guy and a 6+ sack guy. But will he do it? We don't know. We need to see it, but the talent's there. Howard Cross was a very disruptive player for Notre Dame last year. There's no doubt. Jordan Patelho, we saw what he did in the second half of the year when he got opportunities to play. Incredibly twitchy, incredibly disruptive, had 2 sacks and 10 total pressures in the bowl game. So you say, well, how are you going to replace Isaiah Foskey? Here's why Notre Dame beat South Carolina. When South Carolina didn't have guys play that were starters, they complained about it. Well, we didn't have our starter, and so we weren't as good. Notre Dame was able to look at the guys that departed and say, our guy stepped in, and we still made plays. We didn't have Michael Mayer. Mitchell Evans still stepped in and balled out. We don't have Isaiah Foskey. All right. Jordan Patel steps in and balls out. That's the difference. Jason Adamiola can't play. Riley Mills stepped in, balled out, had 1.5 sacks. Right. And so those are the things you look at and say, hey, you don't have Cam Hart. Jaden Mickey stepped in, played good football in that game. And that's the difference. And that's gets back to that depth of talent thing that we talked about. But up front, you saw Jordan Patel show like this is who he can be. He did it against Syracuse as well. It wasn't the only game that he stepped up and balled out. Josh Burnham finished the spring off on a really high note. The folks that read the intel piece, this is one of the nuggets that was in there. There was one of the scrimmages. I don't think it was the Jersey. It might have been the Jersey scrimmage. I'm not sure if it was that one, but I was told by 3 different sources that in one of the team scrimmages late in the spring, that Josh Burnham had like 3 sacks, 2 more tackles for loss, and just dominated the Notre Dame offensive line. Now, I don't think he was going against the starters, but he dominated. And so the player he was at the end of spring was so much better than he was at the beginning of spring. We've talked about his athleticism. You talk about Jason Onye having a great spring. You talk about Gabriel Rubio's now over 300 pounds. That's a former top 100 recruit that grew and grew and grew last season. He was a steady player down the stretch. Now he's in a position to give you some beef, some really big play. Donovan Hinish had a great spring according to very multiple sources. Javonte Jean-Baptiste had a very good spring. We know what Nana can do. So when I look at this football team, and then you add Armel Mukam, who's already up to 270, Boubacar looks like $1 million. He's impressed people so far. You start saying, good Lord, if Al Washington can coach, and I liked what he did this spring, if this guy can coach, Notre Dame is going to be going 10 deep of just waves of defensive players that you can throw. And that's partly what made that 2018 edge rotation so good. You had Khalid Kareem and Julian Aguar as your starters. And the guys that you were bringing off the bench were NFL players. So if you brought out Kareem and Aguara, you put in Dalen Hayes and Adetokunbo Ogundeji. And another guy that played was Jameer Jones, who also has started games in the NFL. So Notre Dame had 5 defensive ends on that 2018 defensive end rotation that were NFL players. 4 of them were drafted. When you can just throw waves of people, remember the Cotton Bowl against Clemson. Early in the game, Clemson's driving. They're in field goal range. It's 3rd down. Julian Aguar gets hurt. He limps off the field. In comes Adetokunbo Ogundeji, and he proceeds to sack Trevor Lawrence and knock Clemson out of field goal range. When you have the ability to just say, hey, Patelho needs a breather right now, that's all good. Tuilaumaka can get after it. Josh Burnham can get after it. Hey, Riley, he needs a series off. Howard needs a series off. Cool. Throw in Onye. Throw in Rubio. Throw in Donovan Hinish. Throw in Tyson Ford. Throw in whoever. When you've got that kind of talent, it starts to get excited. Now that talent needs to equal production. And that's the big question, right? This is why this group is so low, because the potential's there. I even have on my notes, front potential. That's how I'm tagging this segment. It's about potential. And you all know what I say. Potential doesn't win you games. Production does. If the potential becomes production, this defensive line is going to be outstanding. And it's important because I don't believe that you can be a championship caliber team, barring having some sort of Joe Burrow, LSU 1950 point per game offense, that you can win a championship without having a really disruptive and impactful front 7. Notre Dame has the potential to be that. They just got to go prove it. But I am very excited about the potential, and it's a reason why I'm excited about this football team. Number 9 reason why, as we wrap this up, it's just overall talent. And I've talked a lot about this. Where is there a position on the defense or on this football team where you don't think to yourself, there's at least one guy that's an NFL football player? Offensive line, clearly. Running back, clearly. Receiver, multiple. Quarterback, absolutely. Tight end, several. Defensive line, lots. Linebacker, yes, there's NFL guys there, especially the younger classes. Maybe the older guys, we'll see. There's potential there. Corner, certainly. And even safety. Xavier Watts is a guy that has NFL talent and athleticism. He's got to turn it into production, but the talent is there. And we haven't seen this at years in Notre Dame. Again, we're talking about a team that in 2020 had to go to the college football playoff and compete against Alabama in 2020 with Nick McLeod, who was an undrafted free agent and a guy that transferred in as your outside cornerback, and then Clarence Lewis, who was a true freshman, who right now, think about that. Last time Notre Dame made the college football playoff, they had a starting cornerback in that game who right now is battling just to be the number 3 and most likely is going to end up being the number 4. He was a starter. He was the number 5 tackler on that football team that year in Clarence Lewis. And now he's struggling even to get on the field. I think that says a lot about where they are there. And that was, again, folks, that was a playoff team that did that. You look at this football team and the overall talent is just outstanding. It's not proven everywhere. It's not proven at wide receiver. It's not proven at running back after Audric Estime. It's not proven at the defensive line to the degree it needs to be. It's not proven at safety, but the talent is there. And that's something as a coach you work with. Because if you're a coach that's worth his contract, you're going to look at your talent and say, I can work with this, right? I can absolutely work with this. I can promise you all, in my first year as a full-time coach, I coached an All-American running back. We had tons of production. The next year at receiver, I had 2 guys that made it to the NFL. We had tons of production, set team records. My next 2 years at Christopher Newport, we set scoring records. We won more games in my first year at CNU than they've ever won. Still to this day, we set a bunch of, at the time, scoring records, pass game records, all that other kind of stuff. And every single time, I never walked in and said, man, y'all give me some scraps, but don't worry. I got this. I'm going to turn these nothings into something. No, you walk in and you're like, oh my gosh, this is Christmas. God is good to me because he has gifted me with this, and it's my job to get it ready to go because I have the weapons. And if there's a Notre Dame coach on this team that doesn't look at his room and say that, then he needs to go somewhere else and find another job or find another team because the talent is there. It's just, can you do your job to create the leadership, to create the accountability, to create the work ethic, to create the mental toughness, to create the technical proficiency, the schematic proficiency to go out and be effective. That's what we're going to find out. And we've seen this before with Notre Dame. They didn't go from 4-8 to 10-3 and from 16 to 17 because they brought in a bunch of new transfers. Matter of fact, the only guy that I remember being new on the 2017 team was a guy that was on the 16 team. Actually, he was even gone. I can't even think of any new guys on that 2017 defense that weren't around the year before. Now that I think about it, that were on that team. The quarterback was gone. You had a brand new quarterback. You had the same running backs. The new guys that you had were like Cam Smith and Freddie Canteen. Hardly the reasons for Notre Dame turning things around. If you have the right coaching and the talent is there, you can be effective. Well, we're going to find out about this football team is the coaching good enough to get the most out of the talent? I'm confident that it is. I'm confident that in year 2, the players are going to know the scheme better. The coaches are going to know the players better. There's more experience at that top spot that you're going to now get more out of the talent. And that's something that I'm excited about. Last reason number 10, and we're going to wrap this up. Sometimes to kick the door down and win a championship, you need some breaks to go your way. Just the reality of it. You need it to be a year where your football team maybe doesn't have to beat a 2018 Clemson, doesn't have to beat a 2020 Alabama or a 2019 LSU. You say, well, 2013 Florida State. And I think that's one of the unique things about this season. There's a lot of really good football teams around college football this year. But at the same time, I don't know that there's any elite teams like we saw in the past. There's no 21 Georgia. There's no 20 Bama, at least that we know of, right? Like we said yesterday, some team could emerge and be that because we didn't know that 19 LSU was going to be that good. I had LSU as a playoff team that year, but I didn't have them in the winning at all. I didn't think they were going to be a team that scored 49 points a game. I just thought they were going to be better to where the talent was going to finally start producing because you had a better coaching situation. And I was right to a degree, not right enough because I didn't think they were going to be as good as they were. It's not abnormal to see teams make that kind of jump. I think Notre Dame has a chance to be one of those teams. So somebody could emerge like that, but I just don't see it. I don't see that kind of experience. I mean, LSU, even going to 19, they had a quarterback coming back. They had an experienced quarterback coming back. Joe Burrow was coming into his senior season. So it's not like they had a new guy that they had to break in like Georgia does. Georgia's breaking in a new quarterback. Ohio State's breaking in a new quarterback. Alabama's breaking in a new quarterback. Clemson's breaking in a new quarterback. There a lot of the top teams that are the teams that you consider usually the perennial contenders are breaking in new quarterbacks. The exceptions are USC, who I don't consider a perennial contender. You look at Notre Dame's obviously breaking in a new starter, but he's an experienced guy. Michigan's got a returning starter coming back. Penn State's breaking in a new starter. Tennessee's breaking in a new starter. A lot of the teams that people consider contenders outside of LSU, Notre Dame, Texas, USC, and Washington are breaking in new starters. And so I think that factors into it. When you look at Notre Dame's schedule, that's a part of it, right? Notre Dame's schedule is a big part of what I'm referring to in this conversation of looking around college football. The schedule is something for Notre Dame fans to get excited about. You get your first 4 games, you get one good test. You go on the road against NC State. That's a good football team. If you're not a good football team, they can beat you, no doubt about it. But also you've got Navy, you've got Tennessee State, and Central Michigan. So you have a chance to kind of get right before that big Week 5 matchup against Ohio State. Ohio State won't have a similar test to what Notre Dame has coming into the season. They play Western Kentucky, Youngstown State, and Indiana coming into that game. So they won't have an NC State type of road environment, talent on the team to kind of get them prepped for that game. But Notre Dame also gets it at home. So no excuses. No excuses if you lose to Ohio State this year. That means they just whooped you. They're better than you. There's no excuses. You get them at home. You get them before you're going to get too deep in the season where you're worn down. It's also not too deep in the season where their quarterback has a lot more experience than you would otherwise have. Their quarterback's not going to have seen anything like what Notre Dame is going to throw at him. Now, he may still thrive. Jake Fromm hadn't seen anything like what Notre Dame is going to throw at him in 2017, and he did just fine in that game. So we'll find out if Notre Dame can be that disruptive. You look at USC. Again, Notre Dame gets USC at home. USC is a heck of a football team. That's by no means an easy out. But it's, again, you're at home and a team that you were competitive against last year, and you get them at home. Clemson is a team that you got to play on the road. It's going to be tough. That's a tough out, right? Notre Dame has beat Clemson a couple times recently, both times at home. They battled Clemson last time they played down there with Deshaun Watson, a quarterback, but they still lost. So, that's going to be a tough one. But 2 of those 3 big games are at home, whereas last year they were on the road. Combined with you finish relatively, I don't say easy. It's not going to be easy. But if you're who you expect to be, your last 2 games are very winnable games where maybe you don't have to play your starters 95% of the snaps. You should be able to go put a good whooping on Wake Forest and go to put a good whooping on Stanford so you can recover late in the year. And then you get a month off before the playoff if you're able to get there, and you can be a much fresher team. And you have chances to get healthy. So there's just a lot of different reasons where when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, when you look at the teams around college football, that just there's the right ingredients in this pie, right, to make it really good. And it includes your talent, it includes your coaching, it includes your schedule has to be right. It also means that there are years where you have to be in a situation where this is a year that we can get it done. Like I said, what's prompted Alabama's run of 6 titles in however many years? Maybe they beat Texas in 2009. Maybe. I'm someone who believes that a big reason they were able to win that football game is because Colton McCoy got hurt. They were on their second scoring drive against Alabama and were going up 6-0 when Cole got hurt. I still believe that Texas wins that game if Colt McCoy doesn't get hurt. Bama needed a break. But then after that, they earned the win after Colt went down, and then they built on that, and they became the powerhouse that they were. I thought Clemson caught some breaks in 2016 to win that game. They were falling behind 14-0. Ohio State caught some breaks in 2014 that some teams that had a chance to maybe get in over them in 2014 got beat, that allowed Ohio State to continue to climb up the rankings. I think Ohio State started like in the first rankings of the college football playoff rankings. They're like 16th. I don't care who they beat the rest of the way. They don't get up to number 4 if other people don't lose. And so sometimes you got to catch your breaks. But when those teams, when the breaks gave those teams opportunities, they seized it, right? Ohio State caught some breaks to get into the playoff in 2014. But when they got there, they whooped Bama in the second half. They handled their business. They beat the big dog to win a title. They beat the Heisman Trophy, not beat. They destroyed the team that had the Heisman Trophy winner on in the championship game. They earned the championship, but they caught some breaks to get there. And that's needed. That's okay. But you got to go handle your business once you get there. And that's another reason why I believe that this is a team, a Notre Dame team, and the environment is right for them to go out there and compete for a championship. So those are my 10 reasons why I'm excited about this Notre Dame football team heading into 2023 season. And also why, as I hinted yesterday, that when I release my playoff team for 2023, which we'll have before the season starts, Notre Dame will be one of my 4 playoff teams. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm going to dive in here next. I'm going to take a little bit of an intermission, about a minute, so don't go anywhere. I'm going to play the music, so please don't go anywhere. And take a brief intermission. I need to get a couple things and recover this action here real quick. But I'm going to come back. We're going to dive into ACC and Big Ten. This is part 1. I'm going to do part 2 in a future midweek rundown where I'm going to dive into the Pac-12, Big 12, and SEC. But today I'm going to talk about the title contenders, the playoff contenders, which is also the conference champion contenders in the ACC and the Big Ten. It's going to be a fun discussion, so you definitely want to join me on that. If you have some questions that you want me to answer, throw them in a super chat. We do have 5 super chats. I'll ask 4 of them. I'll answer 4 of them because one of them came from someone who is now blocked from the chat. So anyway, get those super chats in if you want me to address them, because there will not be a mailbag today. So I'll be right back to talk about our next topic on the Irish Breakdown podcast. All right, we are back for part 2 of the midweek rundown, and I'm going to look at, obviously, if I have Notre Dame as a playoff contender this year and a team that's going to be in the college football playoff, you also have to look at, well, what are some other scenarios and what are some other teams that you look at as playoff contenders? Because at the end of the day, you could have a playoff resume and not be a playoff team. Perfect example is Ohio State in 2018. In a lot of other years, 2018 Ohio State is a playoff team. In 2017, if Ohio State was what they were in 2018, same record, same bad loss to Purdue, they're in the playoff. There's no question about it, in my opinion. But in 2018, that's some bad luck. You had an undefeated Notre Dame, you had an undefeated Alabama, you had an undefeated Clemson, and you had a one-loss Oklahoma who had a really good resume. So your bad loss against Purdue hurt you more than maybe it did in other seasons. And that's the break sometimes, right? Notre Dame caught a break. You're able to go out there in 2020, get blown out in the ACC title game and still get in the playoff because some other teams got beat. There weren't a lot of other really playoff caliber, playoff worthy teams, except maybe Cincinnati, who didn't play any games against Power 5 teams that year. So sometimes you got to be able to catch some breaks. But there's also, so there's years where you get in when other years you maybe not. But then there's years you don't get in because it's really loaded. So I think it's a worthy discussion for Notre Dame fans to have. But then also just from a college football standpoint, it's certainly a topic of conversation to have. And so that's what we're going to discuss today. Part 1 of this this series is going to be focused on the ACC and the Big Ten. And I think between these 2 leagues, as of right now, and there are 5 teams combined in those 2 leagues that I look at and say, I think these teams are right now playoff contenders right now. They need some things to happen. There's talent. There's whatever the case may be. But this team has a chance to go out there and be a playoff team. And then I'm going to do for each conference, I'm going to kind of pick a sleeper team because there's always that team that kind of breaks out And they're a little bit harder to predict because, as we kind of joked about in yesterday's show during the mailbag, Vince and I talking about if one of us would have picked TCU to be a playoff team, a team coming off of a 5-7 season, their starting quarterback got beat out by a backup, then that guy gets hurt in the first game. You go into the season with a brand new football coach, early 30-something coordinator, and you're thinking to yourself, there's no way TCU is a playoff team. Are you out of your mind? Well, guess what? TCU was a playoff team last year, not only made the playoffs, but then went and won a playoff game, beat Michigan. So there's always those sleepers. So we'll pick those two, and we're going to start with the ACC. When I look at the ACC, for years, it's really been Clemson or bust when it came to the college football playoff. There was really no teams that if Clemson doesn't win the league, that team's going to get in. You haven't really had two good teams in the ACC since Clemson and Florida State back in 2013, right? And obviously that year, Florida State was by far the cream of the crop. I think 2014 was the last year that Florida State beat Clemson in that matchup. That was the year that Deshaun was there. I believe it was a competitive game. Yes, they beat Florida State, beat them 23-17. The next season, Clemson kind of kicks the doors down, beats Florida State 23-13, and after that, it's been a very uncompetitive series for the most part. Really, it's 2016. 2017, Clemson beat them by 17. In 2018, Clemson beat them by 49. In 2019, they beat Florida State by 31. In 2020, they didn't play Florida State during the COVID year. 2021, they beat Florida State by 10, even though they were down. And then last year, they beat them by 6, and it wasn't quite that close. But the point is, Florida State's been gaining on Clemson a little bit, and they're one of the hot teams. And so now you go into a season where I think there's certainly two teams that have an opportunity to be college football playoff team. I'm a believer, y'all know this, however, that you're the champ till somebody beats you, whether that's the national championship, whether that's your conference championship. If you're a team that's been the dominant force for a stretch of time, then I'm not going to predict someone to beat you for that championship until somebody proves it. And that's what Clemson had to do to overtake Florida State. And now that's what Florida State has to do to overtake Clemson. So to me, Clemson is still the big dog heading into the season. But I think it's more than just the fact that Clemson is the defending champs. I actually really like this Clemson football team and think they have a chance to sort of not only stop the bleeding a little bit. They're not the team that they were. This team, to me, is not as good as the 16 team, the 15 team, the 19 team, or even the 20 team to a degree, although it's probably a little closer to that 20 team than it is in any of the others. But they were taking a step back. I think they take a step forward this year, and there's a few reasons why that I think Clemson is still the team to beat in the ACC. Number one is obviously a head coach that's a champion has to make tough decisions. And Dabo made one of those tough decisions this offseason when he got rid of Brandon Streeter's OC and brought in Garrett Riley. I see Brandon Streeter had coached with him for a while. Brandon Streeter played at Clemson. There was a relationship there, but it's what was needed to be done. You bring in Garrett Riley. He still has something to prove to me, but he's still pretty good. And has the DNA, the family lineage, whatever you want to call it. Coaching for Sonny Dykes is also a big thing for him. He was the guy running the TCU offense last year. I think it's not just about Garrett Riley, though. It's, are you bringing in a coach that then fits what you have? And to me, he was a much better fit for who Cade Klubnik is than the previous coaching staff and the previous staff. So I think you've got your young quarterback who's very talented, who was a big-time high school football player, number one quarterback in his class. Showed some things last season, looked like a freshman, but also looked like a freshman with a lot of promise. And now you give him a coordinator that's going to better be suited around him. Look at the receiving core. I think that has a chance to be better this year. Joseph Ngata's gone. He's going to be replaced by an Adam Rando, who I think is a better fit for what they're trying to do. A little bit more explosive athlete. Antonio Williams goes into year 2. Those two sophomores, I think, have a lot of potential. You're bringing in a good freshman class that also can play. This tight end that they have really fits the old school tight end, not the old school, but the type of pass catching weapons that they had, the Jordan Leggett's that they had on those championship teams that can bring something to the table. They bring 4 starters back on the offensive line, and then Tristan Lee's the other starter. He played last year, and he's a very talented player. And so when I look at the offensive line, is it going to be elite? I don't know, but this is one of the more talented offensive lines they've had in a while. Blake Miller's a talented kid. Walter Parks is a talented kid. Tristan Lee is a talented kid. Will Putnam is a talented kid. I don't know as much about Marcus Tate as the others, but in the limited film I've seen of him, he's a good football player. So I think offensively, there's a lot of talent. Now, here's where Clemson could be in trouble. They don't have the depth that we talked about with Notre Dame and some other teams. So if Will Shipley gets hurt, that's a big drop off. If Cade Klubnik goes down or doesn't play well, they're going to be in trouble. The receivers are very young. So if they don't play well, there's not a lot of proven people you can turn to. And I don't think their depth on the offensive line is it's okay, but it's not great. And you look at the defensive line and you say, man, they lost Brian Bresee. They lost Miles Murphy. They lost KJ Henry. But they returned some very talented football players. And Clemson kind of is like what I said about Notre Dame, where you could look at Clemson's quote-unquote backups last year and say, those guys start for a lot of teams. So, yes, you lose Miles Murphy and you lose KJ Henry. Well, they're going to start Justin Maskell and Xavier Thomas most likely this year. 2 very good football players, very talented football players who've played a lot of football. And Xavier Thomas wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for injuries. Now, that's a key. He's got to stay healthy. That's going to be a big key for them, but he's certainly talented. And then, of course, Rook Orororo comes back this season, and Tyler Davis. Those are 2 NFL defensive linemen. And so the depth isn't great there like it used to be, but that's a very talented starting defensive line. Their linebacking core is expected to be one of the best in the country. Your secondary returns all 4 starters. Now, it wasn't a very good secondary last year, and it's getting a lot of hype that I don't know is necessarily warranted. But I think Sheridan Jones and Nate Wiggins have a chance that if they can improve, are going to be quality corners. And then, of course, you have some experience coming back at safety. There's some very good young talent. Their sophomore class in the secondary is very talented and could start to make an even greater impact this season. So I think those are reasons that I look at Clemson and I say they've got a shot. I also think their schedule set up really nicely because if you look at their schedule, their toughest road games are road games that are certainly where they could lose, but also road games that they can win. They're the more talented team, but also that will give you some national love if you win those games. Obviously, you start off at Duke. They play at Syracuse. Those should be wins. They play at Miami. We'll see who Miami is this year. They play at NC State and played at South Carolina. So those are tough road games. They're going to have to win those games. They're tough, but they're all winnable games. The 2 best teams that I think that they play this year, I would argue the 3 best teams that I think they play this year, they all get at home. They get Florida State at home. They get Notre Dame at home, and they get North Carolina at home. And then, of course, they'd have to win a neutral field game, potentially against one of the teams. It could be Florida State. It could be Miami, NC State, or North Carolina, where they get a rematch against one of those teams because the ACC got rid of division. So I think when I look at Clemson this year, I think their schedule sets up well. I think they have a shot to be very good at quarterback. I think the offseason changes they made were for the better, and it gives Clemson a chance to go out and still be the class of the ACC in 2023, which then in turn makes them a playoff contender. Now, here's the interesting part. The ACC champ could have an opportunity to go out this season and be a really good football team, but not be a playoff team. There's a chance the ACC could get shut out because I think for a couple reasons. Number one, the 2 best teams in the ACC have really challenging schedules. Clemson used to be able to just kind of wipe up the ACC because the ACC was down. It's better now. North Carolina's better. Florida State's better. NC State's getting better. I think Miami's coming back. Duke's getting better. Plus, Florida State has to play LSU, and Clemson has to play Notre Dame and South Carolina. And then Florida State has to also play Florida. So I think we could see a scenario where the ACC gets knocked out because they kind of beat each other up. And that's going to be one of the more fascinating aspects of the season because there are all 5 Power 5 conferences. The schedules are such and the depth of the leagues are such and the lack of any great team that all of the Power 5s could end up beating each other up to a degree. Now, they're not all going to, but they all have the potential to, which means this could be the year we finally see a 2-loss team get into the playoff because they are the conference champ. It's going to be very fascinating. I think it would have to be a 2-loss team. To me, would have to be a conference champ, not like Alabama goes 11-1 and then loses to Georgia in the SEC title game and they get in. No, if you're a 2-loss team, you better win your league. But I could see a 2-loss Big Ten champ. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it could happen. When you look at the fact that Penn State has to play Michigan and Ohio State, they all three play each other. Then Ohio State has to, who I think is the best team in the Big Ten, then has to play Notre Dame on the road. So there's a lot of different aspects of this that could make it very, very, very interesting. And so when you look at Florida State, they're another example of that. I love what Florida State has going on this year. Now, there's a lot to prove. Florida State is one of those teams that's kind of getting the benefit of the doubt, and I understand why. But to me, they still have a lot to prove this season. When you look what they did last year, great win over LSU early. Had a really nice win over Louisville. You blow out BC. You're starting off 4-0, and then they lose 3 games in a row. They lose by 10 to Wake Forest, Sam Hartman. They lose on the road at NC State in a weird game that they should not have lost, and then they lost at home to Clemson. And it was a 6-point game, but it wasn't really that close. Florida State, Clemson scored late, just like they did against Wake Forest. I think Wake Forest is up. I think at one point in time, I'm going to have to look that up. I think at one point in time, it was like 28-10 or 28-3. Let me just look their schedule up last year, because a couple of their losses that were 6-10 were not quite as competitive as you might think based on the final score. So against Wake Forest, at one point in time in that game, Wake Forest is up 28-7 in the third quarter. Now, Florida State battled back. They went up, or they scored with 9.5 minutes left to make it 28-21. Wake went on an 18-play drive and took 6.5 minutes off the clock and kicked the field goal to go up by 10 and win the game by 10. But for most of that game, it was not competitive. It was 21-7 at halftime. It was then 28-7 in the fourth quarter before it was 28-13 going into the fourth quarter. It's a game that they dominated. You look at the Clemson-Florida State game, it was 34-14 going into the fourth quarter. Florida State scored twice last time with 2 minutes and 17 seconds left. Now, you get an onside kick, you make a stop, maybe you have a chance to win. But for most of that game, it was not overly competitive. Clemson had a 10-point lead at halftime, scored twice in the fourth quarter, touchdown and a field goal to go up big. So Florida State has a lot to prove. And even late in the year, they have a 7-point win over a bad Florida team. They have a 3-point win over a bad Oklahoma team in the bowl game, which took a little bit of the shine off of just the domination they had in back-to-back games over Miami and Syracuse. But that team showed me something last year, that they're not the same pack-it-in Florida State that they used to be. When they would lose a couple games, they would just go in the tank, and they didn't do that last year. I also think they upgraded their talent. They're going to be loaded at running back this year again. You have Johnny Wilson coming back, who's an outstanding player. You have 3 starting offensive linemen coming back. Of course, Jordan Travis comes back for year 6. Jared Verse makes the decision, shocks everybody, to come back for another year on the defensive line. Fabian Lovett comes back. Kalen DeLoach comes back. You've got a couple starters coming back in the secondary. But then they had some really impact transfers. You talk about Keon Coleman transferring in at wide receiver from Florida State. He's 6'4", about 220, and he's their small receiver because Johnny Wilson's 6'7". You look at, they had Jaheim Bell coming in at tight end, who's going to have a chance to play there. At corner, they had Fentrell Cypress, who transferred in from Virginia. He's a good football player. And then, of course, they had the kid from Western Michigan that Notre Dame looked at, Braden Fisk, who transferred in at the defensive tackle position. And now all of a sudden, Florida State was able to fill some of the questionable holes they had. So there's a lot of talent at Florida State. And I would argue you could make, or I wouldn't argue, I would say you could make an argument for Florida State having an even more talented starting lineup and more depth than Clemson, but that doesn't always mean you're going to be the best team. There's an attitude, there's a discipline, there's a mental toughness, and there's an experiential aspect to being a champion that's going to allow you to win it. Can Florida State be effective in those areas, those intangible areas, is going to be a question. But they could do that and still not make the playoff because of their schedule. And here's what Florida State has this year. They have a neutral field game against LSU, who is going to be a team I talk about when I get into the SEC contenders for the playoff. LSU will go into the season as a contender for a playoff bid. Will they get it? I don't know. I'm not predicting it, but they're definitely in the conversation. They have a neutral field game in Orlando against LSU. They play at Clemson on September 23rd. So the same day that Ohio State and Notre Dame play, you have the Clemson Florida State game. There's, I think, 3 huge games that weekend. I can't remember what the third one is. They play at Pitt, at Wake Forest, at Florida, and then they have home games against Duke and Miami. Then they have a potential rematch against Clemson. So let's just say they're able to go on the road and beat Clemson this year. Okay, that's great. You're now 11-1 at worst, maybe 12-0, but now you have to go play and beat Clemson again on a neutral field. That's going to be tough to do, to beat a team twice. And so the road is harder. Now here's the good part for so I just laid out how the schedule can be a negative for Clemson and Florida State. But here's the positive for those two teams when you look at their potential to be playoff teams in 2023. In the past, you had to basically go undefeated in the ACC to get in. Clemson got in 2017 with a loss. But again, as I pointed out, that was a year where there just weren't a lot of great teams that year. And that's partly what got them in. And people made the excuse, well, they Kelly Bryant got hurt. He wasn't there, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that just wasn't a great Clemson team. They got in the playoff, got smacked by Alabama. They just weren't a good football team. This year's teams have a chance where they don't have to have that perfection to get in. If, for example, Florida State beats LSU and Clemson, and let's just say hypothetically, looking at their schedule, they somehow get upset November 4th at Pitt, right? That happened to Clemson in 2016 as well. But they can get in then because they still have a win at Florida, which is not going to be very good this year, I don't think, but it's still an SEC win. You'd have a win over LSU, and then maybe a loss to, a win over Clemson, then maybe like an upset loss. Or you lose to LSU, but then you run the table and you win your league. That would give you wins over Clemson, potentially 2 wins over Clemson, a road win over Pitt, a win over Miami. And so I think you'd have a schedule that was a lot more manageable. I think that overall, Clemson has a better, deeper schedule because they have North Carolina on it than Florida State does. But both of them have schedules that if you run the table, as long as your loss is competitive and you run the table in your other games, you're going to have a playoff resume. But there's also a chance that those teams could also be both pretty good and still catch 2 losses. And I think that's especially true for Clemson because I think their schedule is even tougher. So let's talk about sleeper teams in the ACC. And I have been back and forth on this team a while, because there are times when I just don't love this team. And there are times when I look at this team and I say, man, you know what? They're going to surprise some people. I think this team is going to be pretty good, and this team could make some noise. And some of y'all are going to laugh at me a little bit on this. But my sleeper team in the ACC, and again, a lot of things that have to go right, but my sleeper team in the ACC is North Carolina. Now, bear with me here. Again, I am not picking North Carolina to make the college football playoff. But if there was a sleeper team, if there was a team that had the ingredients to go out there and make that kind of run, I believe it would be North Carolina. And here's why. What's the number one ingredient that they have? They have a phenomenal quarterback. They lost some guys at the skill positions, but they also returned some. They got a transfer in at receiver who is a very good football player that if he would have transferred into Notre Dame fans would be very, very excited about. There's no question about that. That is Devontae Walker, had 58 catches for 921 yards and 11 touchdowns last year at Kent State. Kid that had 4 catches for 56 yards and a touchdown against Washington. This is a good football player. This kid can play. So you get him in. He's brings them some size. They've got some other guys coming back. They've got a really good tight end coming back, Bryson Nesbitt. Their running back room was a little banged up last year, but I like the talent in the room. Amarian Hampton's a quality football player. George Pettaway is a really good football player. They have some talent there. They have 3 starters coming back on the offensive line. They have a transfer coming in on the offensive line, which helps shore that up. And I know they lost some guys in the secondary, but I'm going to be honest. I feel about them that some of those guys, because of the attitudes and the personalities, it can maybe be a little bit of a addition by subtraction type of situation. I think their offensive coordinator was a problem from a leadership standpoint for them that last year. There's a lot of rumblings that him and Drake May didn't get along real well. That factored into why in North Carolina really fell apart late in the season and had the issues that they had. If you remember, North Carolina was what? Let's see, 9-1 going into the November 19th game against Georgia Tech. They dropped that game, shouldn't have. They lose in double overtime to NC State. They were just worn out at that point in time. And then, of course, got whipped by Clemson in the ACC title game. But, for a while there, North Carolina was climbing up the rankings and looking like a team that had a chance to win the ACC. Just couldn't finish. Then you look at their schedule this season. Defensively, they're now a full more year removed from the Jay Bateman era. They've got some talented kids coming back on the defensive line. They're not going to be great on defense. The question is, they're going to be good enough. And that's the question. And I think North Carolina has a chance to do that. They have a neutral field game against South Carolina to open. We're going to learn right then who North Carolina is. We're going to know in week 1 if my prediction for them as a sleeper team is correct or not. Or I shouldn't, prediction is correct, because the point is, I don't know that they're that team, but I think they have a chance to be. We're going to find out early, because they have a neutral field game against South Carolina in week 1. 2 weeks later, Minnesota comes to town. They're going to at least be physical. We're going to find out if North Carolina can take a punch. Then they go at Pitt, and any doubts about whether they can take a punch will be answered that way. Then they have 3 games at home that are all winnable: Syracuse, Miami, and Virginia. They go to Georgia Tech, I think is going to struggle. Then they have home games against Campbell and Duke. Then they finish up with 2 really tough road games against Clemson and NC State. That's where I think their season will ultimately get derailed. However, if they're able to pull off some upsets down the stretch, I think they're going to have a chance to be that team. Because here's the deal. Clemson and Florida State, most likely, if they're in the title game, are going to have an opportunity. We're going to most likely have to play a rematch. If North Carolina beats Clemson, there's a chance that knocks Clemson out of the ACC title game, and then would put North Carolina against Florida State. And I think that North Carolina has the firepower, potential firepower, to stay in that game, where if they can force some mistakes by Jordan Travis, that they have a shot to pull that upset off. I'm not predicting it, but if a sleeper team is going to come out of the ACC like a TCU, I think North Carolina is a team that's got the tools to do that. I do not think it's going to happen. I think their schedule is a little too challenging. I think their defense is not going to be good enough to make enough stops. And I just don't think they have enough firepower to do it over the course of 13 games. But if there is a team that does it, I think there's a lot of similarities between North Carolina and TCU last season when you look at what made them good and then what I think is going to make North Carolina good. So they are my sleeper team in the ACC. Let's move on to the Big Ten. There's the big 3. Right. And it's really the big 2 with Penn State kind of trying to get in there. And the reason I say that is because Penn State has yet to make a playoff berth. Interestingly, Penn State actually has a college football or a Big Ten championship in the college football playoff era. In 2016, Penn State was the Big Ten champs. They beat Wisconsin in a great comeback that season. Problem was they had 2 losses that year because they just have those games. That's just kind of what it's like with James Franklin. He's just that kind of guy. And so when you look at that 2016 team, that's a team that beat Ohio State. Great win over Ohio State. I think James Franklin's only win over Ohio State. Won their last 8 games of the year in the regular season, blew out Michigan State, beat Iowa, blew out Iowa, blew out Purdue. So they really came out of that Ohio State game well, and then they beat Wisconsin in the bowl game. But the problem is they had an early season loss to Pitt and a blowout loss to Michigan. They just have never been able to put it together. The team that has emerged in recent seasons as the big dog in the Big Ten has been Michigan, and that's where we're going to start here. I really like what Jim Harbaugh is doing with his football team. There's a couple things he's done. Number one, he's kind of getting back to being that physical brand of football that made him so good at Stanford. The biggest difference for me between Michigan's teams pre-2021 and this team is they somewhat resembled his Stanford teams, but not really. And a big part of that was the way they played defense. Very high risk, heavy pressures, and they would be really good statistically, but they'd have 2 or 3 games a year where they would just get ripped up, and they just couldn't make the big stops in the big moments. And you look at the last 2 teams, and they're very much like they were at Stanford. motions and shifts and multiple personnel and angles and leverage and downhill, running it down your throat, take away your will to fight anymore type of football on both sides of the ball. Maybe not a lot of elite defensive players last year compared to 2021 when they had the two great first-round talents on the edge, but they still have enough talent to be really good on defense because they're disciplined, they're very well coached, they don't make mistakes. That's the difference between Ohio State and Michigan last year to me, is with Michigan, you had to beat them to win. Ohio State had a tendency last year in a couple games to kind of beat themselves. Blown coverages against Michigan, turnovers in some bad times, not being able to really make those plays when they needed to make them in those games. Same thing against Georgia when they had an opportunity for victory, but just would made the mistakes that allowed Georgia to get back in the game, blown coverages again, things like that. And Michigan is one of those teams where you have to beat Michigan. And what I mean by that is they're not going to give you the game. They're not going to make a bunch of dumb turnovers in the regular season. We're talking about regular season now. Obviously, playoff has been a little bit different because they had some of those plays against TCU. But in the regular season, you had to beat them. They're not going to beat themselves. And if you make a mistake, they will make you pay. Guys, that's exactly what Stanford was under Harbaugh and then David Shaw early on when Stanford was a great football team. That's who they were. You had to beat them. They were not going to beat themselves. And Michigan is still that team. And I think their talent, they had some years from like 19 to 22 classes where they didn't recruit the same level that they had in the past. So I don't know that their overall talent is as good as some other teams that we're going to discuss. But again, they weren't. That was also true last year, and they still made the college football playoff. And they're able to get away with that because honestly, they schedule like soft intentionally. And you look at their schedule this year: East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, Rutgers. Those are their first 4 games. They're all at home. At Nebraska, at Minnesota, home against Indiana, at Michigan State, home against Purdue. And there's no reason they shouldn't be 9-0 at that point in time. And then these last 3 games are going to define Michigan's season. At Penn State, at Maryland, and home against Ohio State. Now, Maryland gave Michigan a game last year. And I'm very curious to see how that game's going to go. But once again, the Big Ten helps Michigan. Notice what's lacking from their schedule. No Iowa and no Wisconsin. Arguably the 2 best teams consistently in the West. They don't have to play either one of them. They get Minnesota and Nebraska on the road, which are okay teams, but they don't get the big dog. They get Purdue at home. They don't get the 2 big dogs in most seasons in the West. So that stretch of Maryland, and it's back-to-back-to-back in November. It's on the 11th, they play Penn State on the road. On the 18th, they play Maryland on the road. On the 25th, they play Ohio State at home. That's going to be a really tough stretch. That reminds me a lot, to be honest with you, of that 2016 Michigan team that I thought was I think it was 2016. That was probably Jim Harbaugh's best team, in my opinion, prior to his playoff teams. That was the year that they were, 9-0. November 12th, they go on the road to play Iowa. Kind of similar to that Penn State game. And they lose 14-13 in the game they just should not have lost. But that, again, typical Iowa. They had a great defense. Then they have a home game against a quality team, but not a great team. And they kind of scuffle a little bit. You know, that 2016 Indiana team was a bowl team that year, lost by 2 in the bowl game to Utah, beat Michigan State that year, beat Maryland that year, beat Purdue that year. This is a decent team. They scuffled to beat them, but still got the job done. And then they lose to Ohio State on the road. Now, obviously, 2 road games late in the season, Michigan couldn't get it done. Does this Michigan team have a similar kind of end? We're going to find out. We're going to find out if Michigan has the depth. But I think there's no doubt that Michigan goes into this season as a legitimate playoff contender because they're incredibly well coached. They are very good in the trenches on both sides of the ball. They have a quarterback that can make plays on schedule and off schedule, which is important for a team that lacks the perimeter talent that Michigan lacks. They have great backfield, but they don't have, to me, the receivers and the tight end talent to compete with some of those bigger teams. So you need a quarterback that can do things on his own, and I think J.J. McCarthy can do that. You've got 3 starters coming back on your offensive line, and you replace them with 2 talented players. And you really brought in, you might end up having one of your starters get beat out because not only did they bring in Ladarius Henderson from Arizona State and Drake Nugent from he was Stanford, right? They also brought in Miles Hinton from Stanford, who might be their most physically gifted offensive lineman on the roster. Defensively, they bring a lot of guys back. They return 8 starters. I don't love their talent at safety. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. Rod Moore's a solid player. He's not an elite guy. Makari Page has some talent, not an elite guy. I don't know if Amorian Walker's going to start. Some magazines have him slated to start. Others don't. We'll see how he does. They do have Will Johnson, who's a dude. Their linebacker talent is solid. Their defensive line talent is solid, but they don't have the Aiden Hutchinson. They don't have the Mozzie Smith. They don't have the Taco Charlton, Chris Wormley, just that elite talent that they had in 16 on the defensive line. This is a very, very well-coached team that we're going to find out if the other 2 teams in the Big Ten that have more just top-to-bottom athleticism can finally catch up to Michigan or not. But right now, Michigan, to me, is the team to beat when you consider they're the 2-time defending champ. So, again, you're the champ till somebody beats you. Ohio State is not as good as Michigan until Ohio State proves that they're as good as Michigan. That's just the reality, just like it was the case for a decade the other way, where Michigan, no matter how good Michigan was, they were not as good as Ohio State because they couldn't beat Ohio State. We're going to find that out. Penn State's a team that's actually had some good success against Michigan. Not as much recently, but for a lot of years, it was basically whoever was the home team was going to win. And that hasn't been true the last couple of years, but they're going to get them at home this season. And we're going to talk about Penn State in a minute. But when you combine that with the fact that their schedule until that last 3-game stretch is incredibly soft, I think Michigan is certainly a team that has to go into the season as a title contender, or a playoff contender. I could see them being a playoff contender going into November and then dropping 2 games. And that's actually my prediction for the season. I think Michigan is going to run the table, beat Purdue, and then drop the Penn State and Ohio State games. That's my prediction. I could also see a scenario where they pull off an upset on the road against Penn State, upset for me, and then kind of look ahead to Ohio State and then lose to Maryland. That's less likely to me. I could see it, but I think Michigan's going to lose 2 of their last 3 games. And I think one of them is going to beat Ohio State. Now, look, Ohio State's got to prove that they can be that team. And I don't know that they are going to be able to do that. I just have a hard time believing that Michigan can beat Ohio State 3 times in a row. At the same time, I did not think that Michigan go into Columbus and beat Ohio State last year, especially the way they did. So Ohio State's got a lot to prove. This is a gut check moment for Ohio State. And I know a lot of Notre Dame fans, for example, think that Ohio State's going to take a step back. I don't know that they're going to take a step back as a team. I do think, however, because of the way their schedule is, there's an outside chance that Ohio State could actually be 10-2 and be overall a better team than they were last year. It's possible. But I think Ohio State's still the cream of the crop will be the cream of the crop of the Big Ten this year. They haven't been the last 2 years. That's Michigan. And I know we almost beat Georgia, but you didn't. So it doesn't matter. Your 1-point loss to Georgia counts the same in the loss column as Michigan's 6-point loss to TCU, or Notre Dame's 27-point loss to Clemson, or Alabama's 28-point loss to Clemson in 2018, wherever the case may be. An L is an L, and especially in the playoff. So they have a lot to prove to me. But I'm just a little higher on Ohio State's overall talent at certain spots. And I also think that part of the justification that I have for Notre Dame being a playoff team this year is the jump in year 2 of Al Golden's system. I can't say that and then not also give the same benefit of the doubt to Ohio State in year 2 of Jim Knowles' system. My counter to that is in the past, Jim Knowles' defense really needs until year 3 to figure it out and improve. But as I stated last week, those teams at Duke and Oklahoma State that didn't get better till year 3 and really arrive in year 4 in Oklahoma State's case, those teams didn't have the talent. He had to rebuild the scheme and the roster. That's not true to Ohio State. He inherited a pretty good roster. So when you look at this football team, they have one of the best running back groups in the country, the best receiving core in the country. And if you throw the tight end in there, still the same. They have one of the more talented defensive lines in the country, very good, solid linebacker core, good talent in the secondary, not as good as you think. So I don't think this Ohio State team is a vintage Ohio State team. This isn't 2019. This isn't 2018. Those are some teams that just had loads of talent They just couldn't get it done. This isn't the 2015 team to me. It's not that team, but it has plenty of talent to where in a year that I don't believe there's any great teams, Ohio State is certainly poised to be that kind of team. And so when I look at Ohio State this year, the questions are what? Okay, but are they going to be good enough at quarterback? And are they going to be good enough in the offensive line to beat Notre Dame, to beat Penn State, and to beat Michigan? 3 teams that should be pretty good on defense this year. Penn State's front 7 is very talented, especially on the edges. Michigan doesn't have the same level of talent, like high-end NFL talent, but good players, experienced players, and they're going to be well coached, and they've eaten Ohio State's lunch the last 2 years. Notre Dame has to play better against Ohio State, but as we talked about before on the Irish Breakdown show, where we were talking about Notre Dame, I think the talent is there. So Ohio State's offensive line is going to be a big reason why Justin Fry is going to have a big say in whether or not Ohio State is a title contender this year, more than any other coach on their roster. If he can get that offensive line that lost a first or a top 10 NFL draft pick, and then 2 other guys that got picked, you lose DeJuan Jones, you lose Paris Johnson, you lose Luke Whippler. They have not recruited. The previous coach, Coach Studd, did not recruit that position extremely well. I thought Ohio State had a solid offensive line class last year, but none of those guys are play day one guys, or ideally play day one guys. They had to go out in the portal, get the offensive lineman from San Diego State. And so you come into the season where offensive line is a major question mark because you have a great backfield and a great receiving core. But what can be the kryptonite to those 2 units? Not great quarterback play and not great offensive line play. And those are 2 big question marks for me for Ohio State, and why, even though I think Ohio State's going to be the cream of the crop, if they're not, and if I'm wrong on that, we're going to point to those 2 areas. They weren't good enough at quarterback and they weren't good enough up front. Now, when we talk about quarterback, to me, I think that Kyle McCord or Devin Brown, whoever starts, is going to put up numbers. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They are going to go out this season. They're going to put up numbers against Youngstown and Western Kentucky and Maryland and Purdue and Rutgers and Michigan State and Minnesota. The question is, are they going to be able to, whoever the quarterback is, can he make the money plays? And I think when you look at CJ Stroud last year, even in some of the games where he wasn't putting up like great numbers or just ripping teams apart, Notre Dame game being a perfect example, CJ Stroud had one of his least productive games of his career. If you look at it, he averaged 6.6 yards per attempt that game. The only other game in his career that was worse was the crazy win game against Northwestern. Lowest yards per attempt of his career. It was one of his lowest passer rating games of the season. He only threw for 223 yards in that game, which is very low for him for a game he plays 4 quarters. Very low for him. But what was the difference in that game? In the second half, when he needed to make money throws, he made them. And that to me is what makes you a productive quarterback versus a winner. And he made those plays. You look at the Penn State game. He made some absolute monster throws when he needed him to make those throws. Same thing against Georgia. I mean, he put that team on his shoulders at time and made those plays. He didn't do it against Michigan either time, which is why maybe some people don't view him as good as I view him. But he was a winner. He was a guy that could go out there and make plays when you needed him to make plays in those games. And we saw it against Utah the year before. We saw it against Michigan State the year before early, just ripped them up. We've seen him do it against Penn State multiple times. And look, they didn't lose the game to Oregon the year before because of CJ Stroud. I can assure you of that. So can Kyle McCord or Devin Brown make those plays? If the offense is scuffling against Notre Dame the way that they did last year, can those guys make those tough sideline throws the way that CJ Stroud did? Can they look out and say, hey, new guy over the slot, Tariq Bracy's out, let's go right there to that matchup very next play? Do they have that recognition that CJ Stroud had to make those throws? That's going to be the big question for me. And if they do have that, are they going to have the time to do it? That's also the question. So you don't want to have question marks at quarterback and offensive line. And that's where Ohio State could have some problems this year. But if they can shore up those 2 positions, especially the offensive line, then Ohio State will be not just a playoff contender, but a title contender. Because I do think they're going to continue to get better on defense in year 2 of Jim Knowles. and then even better the next season, in my opinion. Even though they're going to have some personnel losses after this year, I just think the feel of the system, and they've recruited pretty well the last 2 years on the defensive side of the ball. So if they lose Tommy Eichenberg and Steele Chambers and those guys this year linebacker, they're just going to replace them and reload with even more physically talented players that next year. That's just the reality of what it's going to be. So Ohio State's going to keep being the title contender. Is this year they get it back on track? Quarterback and offensive line are going to be the key. Now, here's a team that I have thought in recent seasons gets way too much publicity, but this team actually is one that I think this season's version is one that I think could be pretty good, and that's Penn State. Penn State was ranked way too high last year, in my opinion, because they just simply put, weren't as good as their record indicated. Ohio State did not play very well against Penn State, I didn't feel, and still beat them by 13. Michigan played like garbage against Penn State in the first half. It wasn't so much Penn State playing well, it was just Michigan playing poorly. And they still went out and just steamrolled them in the second half on 41-17. It was really the only two good teams they played all year in the regular season. Auburn stunk, Purdue, Ohio, Central Michigan, Northwestern, Minnesota at home, Indiana, Maryland, Rutgers, Michigan State. They had a nice win over Utah. Very nice win over Utah in a bowl game. Utah was banged up. Quarterback got hurt. All types of things in that game. But still a great win, I should say. I shouldn't even say good. It was a great win for them. They come out this year. I think that momentum of how they finished the season is going to help them. Y'all know I'm a big believer in that. They won their last 5 games. Beat Michigan State soundly at the end, and then had the big Rose Bowl win over Utah. I think it's going to give an otherwise young team at certain important spots a lot of confidence to step in. And so when I look at Penn State, the first concern that I have when I look at this football team is, yes, they have a talented quarterback, but he's young and he's raw. He's not a Bryce Young. He's not a CJ Stroud. He is a smart, savvy, high accuracy level type thrower. Drew Aller is very raw, but he's incredibly talented. How quickly can they get him caught up to speed? That's going to be a big question. If they can get him to just be a good football player, like Michigan did with J.J. McCarthy last year, then I think Penn State has a chance to be really good. I love the talent around him. I think, obviously, the running back room, Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, and Penn State are all in the conversation. I think are all going to be in the conversation to be the best running back rooms in the country. And Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan have the established talent to be in that conversation. To me, Notre Dame, it's more projection. But for the other three, there's no doubt the talent and the proven production is there. Nicholas Singleton at Penn State has a chance to be the best running back in college football this year. He's not the best coming back. That's Blake Corum. He was the best last year. But I love Nicholas Singleton. Had a great freshman year, 1,061 yards, rushing, 12 touchdowns, 6.8 per carry. And against Utah, he has 7 carries for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns against a pretty good rushing team. He was pretty good in that game. Didn't do much against Michigan and Ohio State. That's the knock, right? And that's something he's going to have to get better at. But that, to me, comes down to the offensive line, which we'll get to. But here's the thing. It's not just the Nicholas Singleton show. Katron Allen's a really good football player. He could start for a lot of teams that Penn State plays. Also a freshman last year. He had 867 yards and 10 touchdowns, 5.2 per carry. He's another really good football player. Sean Clifford was a great leader, but he was limited. I mean, just talent-wise, he was limited. And you're going to have a guy that isn't the experienced guy that you have now, but huge arm. I like the talent at receiver. I like Keandre Lambert-Smith. He's a good football player. I like Dante Cephas, the kid from Kent State. We talked about him. Notre Dame fans, we wanted Notre Dame to give him a look. They tried. He wasn't interested. But I think he's a kid that is, that could be a slot guy, could play outside for them. He's a really good football player. I like what he brings to the table. I think when you look at their other receiver positions, looking at them up right now, you've got Harrison Wallace. Caden Sanders is going to be a sophomore this year. I think there's some talented football players that they have, and they're really good at tight end. Theo Johnson should be back and healthy this season. He's a good football player. Brenton Strange, I believe Brenton Strange is back this year. Did he go pro? No, he went pro. They got Tyler Warren. They can go 2 tight ends. They can go 3 tight ends. Tyler Warren had 10 catches last year. He's a guy that can play. The key is going to be their offensive line, right? You've got one of the best tackles in football in Olu Fashanu. You've got some experience coming back. I felt like last year, they haven't been the offensive line that I thought they were going to be. And when they brought the guy over from BC, but they started to show that last year. Salim Wormley, if you all remember, is a guy that I was very high on coming out of high school. He's starting to kind of come into his own. Camden Wallace is a really talented kid. Landon Tangwell, remember, he's a guy that Notre Dame recruited very heavily, went to Penn State. He's slotted to potentially step into left guard position. I think the offense has a chance to be really good, and they can bring Drew Aller along. And that, to me, is a big, big part of it for two reasons. Number one, you have the run game potential to thrive, and the schedule gives you a quality game, and then a game that you should win convincingly before your schedule ramps up. And that's the other tough part for Penn State. I love their defense coming back. They've got a lot of talent on the front seven coming back. Abdul Carter was great as a freshman last year. Danny Davis-Sutton is going to be a much bigger factor this year. He's super talented. You bring back Kalen King. They did have some really good players they lost in the secondary. Obviously, Joey Porter Jr. They've recruited well on that side of the ball. They've got some really talented players stepping in. I think their defense should be good. I'm not a big Manny Diaz fan, but I don't even think Manny Diaz can screw this one up. He did a nice job with them last year. But the issue that I have for Penn State is I think of the three teams this season that are competing for the Big Ten, Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, Ohio State to me is the toughest schedule of the three. When you look at the fact that they have to play at Notre Dame, they have to play at Michigan, they have to play at Wisconsin, they have to play Penn State at home. That's a tough schedule for me. If Ohio State's 11-1, 12-0 against that, they are big time. They are very good. Penn State to me is next, and I think Penn State's got a challenging schedule. They have West Virginia at home, should be a win. Then they play Delaware. Their third game is going to be it's a game that not a lot of people are talking about. These next 2 weeks are going to define Penn State's season, in my opinion, because they could be out of the playoff hunt by the end of September. They play at Illinois in week 3. And I know Illinois lost some big-time football players last year. They've got some big-time football players coming back, and now they're going into year 3 of the Brett Bielema era, which is going to be good for them. And Luke Altmaier's not a great player by any stretch, but he's certainly more talented than what they've had at quarterback in recent seasons. So I think they're going to be fine. They've recruited well. Brett Bielema knows how to win. That's going to be a really tough game. And then the next week, they're home against Iowa. Now, Iowa and Penn State playing a lot of good battles, and I'm very high on Iowa. I'm going to talk about them in a second here, so bear with me as we get ready for Iowa. But when I look at Penn State, those 2 games early with a quarterback who's still learning could be problematic. You could lose one or both of those games, and now you're in a situation where you've got to run the table to have a miracle shot of getting into the college football playoff. And then you've got to hope that if you lose to Iowa or Illinois at home, you've got to hope that you can get them in a rematch in the Big Ten title game where you can say, hey, look, we were young early. We had a sophomore quarterback, sophomore running back, young at receiver, young here, young there. And we bounced back. We beat Michigan at home. We beat Ohio State on the road. We beat Michigan State on the road. We got a rematch win over one of those 2 teams. And we belong in. It's going to be a tough sell, but as I said, this could be a year where a 2-loss team who's a conference champ has that opportunity. If they win those 2 games, they've got Northwestern the last week of September on the road. That's a mess of a program. Then they have a bye. Then the week before they play Ohio State, they have UMass. So if they can somehow beat Illinois and Iowa, you're going to have a 6-0 Penn State team heading to Ohio State. Coming out of that, they're Indiana at home, at Maryland. It's going to be a rivalry game. Penn State's dominated that recently. Then they finish the season at home against Michigan, home against Rutgers, at Michigan State. Now, the at Michigan State game actually it's listed at Michigan here, but it's not at Michigan State. I believe that's a neutral field game that's going to be played in Detroit at Ford Field. So that won't even be a road game, but it'll be certainly away from home, much closer to Michigan State than it is Penn State. If they can run the table in September, split the Ohio State and Michigan games, then they're going to that's their chance to me to be a playoff team. I don't know if Penn State's good enough to win both of those games. That's going to be a tough ask. But they don't have the Notre Dame non-conference like Ohio State does. But they also have a really tough crossover. 2 tough crossover games, which Michigan and Ohio State does because at Wisconsin, although I'm not as high on Wisconsin as others, but that's still a tough game. Playing at Camp Randall is not easy. I don't care who Wisconsin is, right? But Ohio State and Penn State have the tougher crossover games, and Penn State has 2 really tough crossover games with the West. So that's the difference, where Michigan just kind of steamrolls until they get into November. My prediction for the year is Ohio State beats both. Penn State, and Michigan. But I also believe that I believe Penn State will then beat Michigan. So whether or not Penn State has a chance to be the second Big Ten team in this year's versus Ohio State is going to be determined by what they do in those 2 September games against Illinois and Iowa. I think that's going to be the key to whether or not Michigan's going to be able to have, or excuse me, Penn State's going to be able to have a playoff resume going into the season. So to me, they are a team that belongs in the conversation. They have more to prove than the other 2 Big Ten teams, but they belong in there. So who's my sleeper pick in the Big Ten? I think most of you are already going to know this because I've talked about it before. It's not Wisconsin. I'm not as sold on Wisconsin's ability to quickly transition to that offense. I think that's going to be a lot harder than some people think. The team that I'm really looking forward to seeing this season is Iowa. And look, I get it. Iowa lost some really good football players off their defense from last season. They did. There's no doubt about it. Jack Campbell, I mean, y'all know Ryan loved that guy. He was a stud. They also had a first-round draft pick at defensive line with Lucas Van Ness. They had a defensive back, and I'm trying to remember who their DB was that the Broncos drafted. I'm trying to remember which guy that was. But the Broncos drafted one of their DBs in the 3rd round from last season. He was a really good football player. Really liked his film. I just cannot, for the life of me, remember what his name was. Riley Moss. That's what his name was. Riley Moss was the guy they drafted from Iowa last year. So they certainly have some losses, but they have a lot coming back. They returned their starting running back. Most of their receivers are back. They got a tight end coming back. Even though they lost their top tight end, Sam Laporte, they get Eric All from Michigan comes in, who I think is a really quality football player. They got Caleb Brown to transfer in from Ohio State, who I liked a lot coming out. I think he gives them some juice that they didn't have before. And the Cade McNamara pickup, to me, was huge. Look, Cade McNamara is not a star. He's not. I mean, he's a good football player. That's it. He's a game manager football player. But compared to Spencer Petras, this is like Notre Dame getting Sam Hartman, if not more. Like Spencer Petras, and I'm not trying to be hard on the kid, but he's one of the worst Division I quarterbacks I've ever seen. And even with that issue, Iowa still won 8 football games last year. Think about this, folks. Iowa won 8 games, beat Purdue, who won the West, beat Wisconsin, beat Minnesota down the stretch, beat Kentucky in a bowl game 21-0. They did that with an offense that scored 17.7 points per game. Think about that. They had one game last year where they scored over 27 points. That was against Northwestern, who was terrible. So to me, you give them an offense that scores 26, 27 a game, which is I think is about where the number is for Ferentz's kid to get a pay raise, right? They scored 27 points a game. They're going to be incredibly hard to beat. And so I think Iowa's a team that people are sleeping on a little bit because of McNamara, because of Caleb Brown, because of Eric All. They returned 4 starters in the offensive line. They lost 3 really good players, but that's about all they lost from the defensive line last year, or from the defense last year. They return a lot of talent from their defense as well. They bring back Deontay Craig, who had a very good season last year, led them in tackles for loss with 11, led them in sacks with 6.5. They bring back Cooper DeJean, who's one of the best DBs in the country. They bring back some really, really good players this season. So I think Iowa's got a shot to be that sleeper team that could be actually a playoff team. And here's why I say that. When you look at Iowa, they play Utah State, Iowa State on the road. Iowa State's not very good. And then they play Western Michigan. They play at Penn State. Now, let's say they lose to Penn State. Basically, here's what the rest of their season looks like. Michigan State at home, Purdue at home, at Wisconsin. That's going to be huge. Minnesota at home, bye week. They play Northwestern at Wrigley, home games against Rutgers and Illinois, and then at Nebraska. Even if they lose to Penn State, there's a chance Iowa's 11-1 going into the postseason. Or, they beat Penn State, lose to Wisconsin, but let's say they drop one of those 2 games. There's a good chance they're 11-1 going into the Big Ten title game. And if you have a win over Wisconsin, if you have a win over whoever the Big Ten East champ is in this year, there's a chance that Iowa could be a playoff team. Now, I'm not predicting that. I'm just laying out the path for what it could be. And then when you look at those teams that they're playing against, and you look at Ohio State, for example, and you look at Penn State and Michigan, those teams are going to play really rough November stretches, right? So Penn State ends their season with Michigan, Rutgers, and Michigan State. That's not as tough. But then you look at Ohio State. They have to play Minnesota and Michigan to end the season. Michigan obviously being the last game. They play Wisconsin October 28th. And then Michigan, as soft as their schedule is, has by far the toughest finish to the season when you look down the stretch, when you look at playing at Penn State, at Maryland, and against Ohio State. And then Iowa, who's got a good finish to the season, Rutgers, Illinois, and Nebraska is nothing to snooze over, but it's not playing Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State. So to me, Iowa's a team that if they can catch some breaks, not get upset by Iowa State, split between Wisconsin and Penn State, and then handle their business in their other games, we could see this, because I kind of feel like this is going to be sort of that miracle season for them. I think that this is it for Kirk Ferentz. I think the people around the program have to be getting that sense. He went all in the portal to bring some guys in. They go out, they go 11-1, win the Big Ten. It's that dream season, and then Kirk Ferentz rides off into the sunset. I could see something like that happening. I'm not predicting it. I'm not putting my mortgage on it. But I'm not, if laying out that case, I'm not saying to myself, like, dude, that you're reaching, you're just trying to find a sleeper. I believe that Iowa can be that team, because you give them just competent quarterback play. And that's all Cade McNamara is, folks. He's just competent. That's it. This is a kid who was in a playoff 2 years ago because he could just manage the offense, not make the big mistakes, played well in some of their bigger games. You put him at Iowa, where I think their run game is going to be better. He's going to have some weapons around him, and they're still going to have a great defense, because even though they lost some players, guys, they lose players every year, and they just replace them, because the one consistent thing has been Phil Parker. Right? Lucas Van Ness and Deontay Craig were great last year, but they had to replace Van Valkenburg from the year before, who was a 15 tackle for loss guy. Right? And they replaced him just fine. Right? Van Valkenburg replaced from 2020 Davion Dixon and Chancey Golston, who had Davion Dixon in 2020 had 13.5 tackles for loss in 8 games. That's it, because of COVID. Right? Well, then Davion Dixon, had to replace AJ Epinesa, who had 14.5 tackles the year before, right? And then in 2019, Chancey Golston steps up, has 9.5 tackles for loss, has a really good season as the number 2, and he had to replace Anthony Nelson, who had 13.5 tackles for loss the year before. So this has just been something, and those guys had to replace Parker Hess, who had 10 tackles for loss. You get the point? It doesn't matter who Iowa puts in there. They recruit players that fit their system, and they're coached up as well as any defense in the country's coached up. So they're going to still be really good there. It's the offense. Can the additions they had on offense, can the motivation that Brian Ferentz has, that if you don't do it now, you're A, not going to get paid as much, and B, you're not going to have a job most likely. Is that going to be enough to get this team going? Yes. I don't see them losing 7-3 games this year, or winning 7-3 games, or 10-7 games, or losing games like that this year. So I think Iowa's going to be a better football team than people expect, and they're sort of my, if a team breaks out from the Big Ten that's not one of the big 3, Iowa's my bet to do that. Not Wisconsin, but Iowa. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. That went a lot longer than I thought. I have some super chats I'm going to get to here before we go. But I'd love to know, like, we can take this conversation on the board. I'd love to hear from you guys who you think are the title contenders in the ACC and the Big Ten. Who you all think are the sleeper teams in those conferences. What do you think of my picks of sleeper teams? You can have that at boards@irishbreakdown.com. We can continue this conversation. I think it'll be a lot of fun. And then also, I'd love to hear on the message board. I'd love for somebody to start a thread on the board where you say, hey, look, from today's show, what are your reasons that you're excited about this football team? I'd love to hear it. But before we go, I do want to get to some of these super chats real fast. Rob Osgood, thank you, Rob, for the super chat. And Rob says, I'm excited about the quarterback. I know the potential's there, but when was the last time Notre Dame had a quarterback with Sam Hartman's talent? Plus year 2 of the D. I'm excited of the younger guys there. Thank you, guys. You're welcome, Rob. And a lot of those are reasons that we're on the same page. Raymond Horton says, looking forward to a great show today. I hope it was, Raymond. And a great season, regardless of the sky is falling so-called fans that showed up today. Thanks, Brian, and go Irish. There's only a couple. Right? I think most people in the chat today were excited. And then also Raymond, thank you for that super chat. Shaquille Oatmeal with a Euro super chat. Who else can do that? Not many, my friend. Not many. And we appreciate you being with us over the last couple of years as well. So, hey, y'all, enjoyed the show today. We'll be back tomorrow, 1 o'clock. Vince and I'll be back. We're going to break down the Notre Dame safeties. And then Friday, it'll be Vince and Ryan in the mailbag. So, and then Saturday, we'll be back. I'm going to take kind of a day off on Friday-ish. We'll see how much of a day off I can actually take. I was planning on taking the whole week off. That's not going to happen. But I'm at least try to take Friday off. So y'all behave, be good. So you're going to get Ryan and Vince in the show on Friday for the mailbag, and then Vince and I'll be back on Saturday. So definitely sign up for the message board, everybody. boards.irishbreakdown.com. Tons of great content. When I get done with this, I'm going to edit this show. I'm going to then publish the podcast. When I'm done with that, I'm going to go finish my intel piece where I'm talking about all the intel I've gotten from all my sources on the Notre Dame running backs and the Notre Dame receivers. And there is some really, really juicy stuff in there. So you definitely want to check that out. But that's only intel only, message board only stuff. You got to go check it out. There's going to be some douchebags that are going to take it and put it out there. But if you really want it, you want it right now, you need to be a member at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So definitely check that out. You can be a monthly member, annual member, or you can join the Booster Club and check that out too. So definitely make sure that you're looking for that here later this evening. So have a great day. I'll talk to you all here again very, very soon. 6 o'clock tonight, IB Nation Sports Talk, Midweek Mailbag with Sean and Vince. You want to check that out as well. That'll be another great show by those guys. And then I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you all for joining me on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.